I recently moved into a new house in a quiet suburban area. I'm not going to say where because it's had its fair share of media coverage and teens showing up at night trying to get a glimpse inside the infamous house. It had been on the market for 3 years, and I secured the house at a much cheaper price due to the fact that 2 people had been found murdered there. The mystery and brutality of the murders catapulted the story into the local news. No specific details were released to the public, and I only found out about it because a friend of mine is a local realtor with connections. Nobody was ever arrested for the murders. A male in his 30s was found in the living area, and a female in her 30s was found barricaded in the basement. Another mysterious fact was that the woman had barricaded herself in from the inside in a desperate attempt to stop someone or something from getting in. Yesterday, whilst doing some cleaning in the basement, I came across a cell phone that had fallen down a gap behind the washing machine and the wall, and there's a voice recording on it, recorded the same night of the murders by the female victim, and it's pretty terrifying. I've already handed it into the police, but I made a transcript of the recording. What you are about to read is the unedited transcript of the cell phone recording found in the basement. I have to admit, it's extremely disturbing. The desperation in her voice will haunt me forever. Here goes. If you're hearing this, please, please, please give it to the police. My husband is dead. It killed him. I'm so sorry, Scott. I can hear it now, upstairs, looking for a way in, and it's only a matter of time before it finds one. I've barricaded myself in the basement, and I've got my eyes on the only door, one way in, one way out. You see, it can't move if you're looking at it. It began 12 weeks ago. The night Scott, my childhood sweetheart and husband of 5 years, confessed that he'd had a drunken one-night stand on his bachelor party in Europe. The apparent guilt had consumed him for the past 5 years, and his sudden urge to be truthful was due to the fact we were due to get married this same year. His words hit me like a freight train, and the urge to vomit washed over me like a tsunami. I stormed out of the house, our house that we'd bought together 12 years prior. I felt like the world had swallowed me whole, and in a way, it had. I was struck with a throbbing chest pain that rapidly spread down my entire right side. The pain intensified, taking my breath away, and I stumbled into a tree to steady myself as I felt my body about to faint. Then darkness. The next thing I remember was waking up in a dark and dismal forest, devoid of color. The air was dry and had a distinctive, malodorous smell like rotten meat or that of a decaying carcass. But worst of all was a terrifying feeling that I'd never experienced before, and one that I pray I'll never feel again. The feeling of absolute hopelessness. The sky was dull and cloudless and was ripped apart by soundless, ferocious lightning that illuminated the bleak landscape I found myself in. I felt like I'd been wandering for hours, maybe even days, when I came across a decaying cave. Animal bones crushed beneath my feet as I made my way towards it. As I approached the cave, the putrid smell grew with intensity, causing me to retch, and I was violently sick, bringing up my own stomach bile. The entrance was made of crumbling stone and was completely opaque. I threw a small stone into it and heard it ricocheting down the stone steps and off the walls. The silence lighting strobed the area, and I was able to glimpse into the cave and see a few descending steps. Then, 2 yellow reptilian-like eyes flashed in the darkness. I stumbled backwards, and just as the lightning struck, I was forcefully thrown by an unseen force. The lighting flashed continuously, accompanied by a gale-force wind, tossing me around like a rag doll. My eyes were fixed on the cave, and I crippled in terror as a pale, gangly hand reached around the crumbling stone. Another flash hurled me hard against a tree, and suddenly, I woke up in the back of an ambulance with paramedics hovering over me with a defibrillator and 2 words that sent a cold and grotesque shiver through my spine. Welcome back. Back from where? What was that place? That thing in the cave? How long was I gone? Hundreds of questions raced through my mind, but none of which I had the answer for. Not yet anyway. You died in the back of that ambulance, the doctor said, as I lay in a bed in the ICU. The room tilted as I tried to digest what the doctor was telling me. I felt like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I'm 30 years old, I eat healthily, and I run 4 times a week. How could this be happening to me? My scans revealed I'd inherited a faulty gene and developed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and suffered a cardiac arrest. I spent the next 7 weeks in the ICU and told nobody of the dark forest and the creature with the yellow eyes. Just the thought of that place was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. My mother practically moved into the hospital, fussing over me like mothers do. She blamed herself for my condition, even though her scans were clear, meaning that I inherited the faulty gene from my absent father. My husband Scott came on the first day, but I asked him for space. I needed some time to heal and process everything that had happened about both my condition and his infidelity. Although he kept that promise, he would call my mom every day to check on me, to make sure I was okay. I wasn't, not because of my condition, but for something else. I'd started to see something. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It started as a tiny dot in my peripheral, nothing more than a speck on my retina. Of course, I had my eyes checked, but all results came back clear, as did the results for my visual cortex. Days later, what started as a dot in my peripheral began to grow. The first time I saw it, I was at my doctor's office. He had left me alone for a moment whilst he consulted with my surgeon. It was dark outside, and the sound of heavy rain pitter-patting against the glass was hypnotic. I stared out of the window, watching as a small handful of people came in and out of the hospital. Then, my eyes were drawn to an ominous silhouette at the far end of the parking lot. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features due to the minimal light, but there was something there, standing deadly still in the shadows. A car horn broke my reverie. A man was getting into his truck in the lot and must have pressed the horn by accident. I turned back to the silhouette, and it was in a completely different position. It had moved. It was standing eerily still again, but like it had frozen mid-walk. I could just about make out its elongated limbs, like its arms and legs had been stretched out. The doctor returned momentarily, startling me. He'd gotten my scans, and everything was how it should be. "Good news, you should be okay to be discharged in a few days," he said. That was great news. I was so ready to get out of the hospital. I turned back to the window in curiosity, but whatever I saw had gone. I didn't think about it again until the night before I was going home. It was late, and most of the patients were sleeping. My room is situated at the end of the hall, so I get a clear view of it through my observation window. I wasn't quite ready to go to sleep, and was watching something on my iPad. Suddenly, there was a putrid odor wafting in through my open door, the same unmistakable smell that I'd experienced in that other place. 2 nurses walked past my room, neither showing any signs that they too could smell it. I covered my nose and mouth to try and stop me from heaving. Then, my eyes drifted to the observation window and to the corridor. It was here again, the silhouette at the far end of the hall, completely still, with its back pressed up against the wall. But I could see it. It was tall and skinny and had either feelers or tentacles stretched up against the wall like an ink spill. Its daunting yellow eyes stared straight at me. I saw another nurse walk up the hall and straight past it like it wasn't there. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe visual hallucinations were a symptom of what I'd been through, or maybe it was a side effect of the many meds I was taking. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "There's nothing there. It isn't real," I whispered to myself. I opened my eyes, and it hadn't gone. It had moved closer, halfway down the hall. It had dropped onto all fours like a large dog, looking straight at me. Its long tentacles spread across the floor and up the wall. I was absolutely petrified. I moved over to the window, tentatively. The smell that resonated from this creature was overpowering. I watched it for a few moments until a nurse walked past the window, startling me. And, like before, when I looked back, it wasn't there. It was as though I'd imagined it. I climbed back into bed, but I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, my mom came to pick me up. I left with a suitcase of medication and instructions on how and when to take them. I didn't tell my mom or anyone at the hospital about my hallucinations. I was worried if I did say something, the doctors wouldn't let me leave. I had decided to stay at my mom's until I was ready to talk with Scott. He brought a box over with some essentials, like my comfy clothes, pajamas, and my own toothbrush, as I'd been using a cheap store-bought one up to now. He was sorry, and it was clear he hadn't been sleeping. He said he'd wait for me until I was ready to talk. I miss both him and our home so much, but I just wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. My mom suggested that I go into town, see the locals, get some fresh air into my lungs. She offered to drive me and then we would meet back up at the car after an hour. Whilst in town, I noticed a poster for the yearly traveling fairground in a storefront window. I have fond memories growing up of this fair. It's where Scott and I shared our first kiss. They were halfway round the Ferris wheel when it started to rain. He covered us with his jacket, and then he kissed me. This was the moment I knew I'd fallen in love with him. I was flooded with happy emotions, and it felt right that I text Scott, "I'm ready to talk. I'll be at the place where we shared our first kiss at 8 tonight. Chloe X." He replied almost instantly, "I'll be there, thank you X." After a quick smile to myself, I went for a walk through the local market. It was bustling with energy, vendors selling local, fresh produce, handmade furniture, bakeries, and plenty more. After browsing the stalls, I was hit with that smell, that horrific, nauseating smell, and I felt the hairs on my arms prickle up. I knew it was here, somewhere, observing me. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the area. I weaved in and out of the locals looking for it. Paranoia struck me like lightning. I was bumping into people as I went. All eyes had now turned to me. I burst into tears, sprinted back to the lot, and leaped into my mother's car. I was sitting in the passenger seat crying my eyes out. I looked out of the window and saw my mother rushing back to the car shouting my name. Someone must have told her about my freak out. I looked out of the opposite window, and it was there, standing on top of a vehicle several cars over. Dead away from me, I screamed. My mother whipped open the door. "What is it? What happened?" She replied. She couldn't see it. Nobody could. I told her that I'd had a panic attack. I hadn't been around people outside of the hospital for a few months, and I felt overwhelmed. She knew I wasn't being truthful, but it's the only answer I could give. That night I decided to go ahead and meet Scott at the fair. When I saw him waiting for me by the Ferris wheel, my heart felt whole again, if only for a moment. We got our tokens and went on the wheel. We talked as we went round about how sorry he was and how much of an idiot he'd been, which I agreed with. Everything was going well until I saw the creature again, standing on top of the ghost house attraction, watching me. I kept my eyes on the figure whilst grabbing Scott's arm. "Do you see it?" I asked with a shaky voice. "See what?" He replied. "It's standing right there, on top of the ghost house." I could see him squinting to look, but I knew deep down that he wouldn't be able to see it, because only I could. "Sweetheart, there's nobody there. Look at me," he replied, calmly. "I can't," I said solemnly. "If I look away, it'll move." "Chloe, look at me. There's nothing there," he said, as he grabbed my chin and turned my face towards his. "No, it'll move. It wants me to look away," I screamed. I quickly spun round, my eyes darting back to the ghost house, but it wasn't there. I looked around, anxiously, Scott looking on with worry. Damn, where is it? My anxiety palpable. I looked down, and it was at the bottom of the Ferris wheel. It had moved inhumanly fast. I screamed and almost fell out of the carriage, but Scott held on to me. Hey, I got you, what is it?" he said, desperately trying to keep hold of me. I stood up in a panic, rocking the carriage. Scott tried to hang on to me, but it was too late, and I plummeted 20 feet to the ground. The last thing I remember was Scott screaming for an ambulance. I was fortunate enough to only suffer a sprained wrist and a slight concussion. My doctor wanted to keep me in overnight for observations, which I reluctantly agreed to. I decided to confide in Scott. I told him everything, from the cave in the forest to this creature that's stalking me, this monstrous entity that must have crawled out of the pits of hell. And worst of all, it's getting closer to me. He could see that I was terrified, and instead of trying to explain away what I was experiencing, he just held me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. We spent hours just holding each other. He offered to stay the night, to stay awake in the chair, whilst I got some sleep, but I couldn't have him doing that. After Scott left, I managed to get a few hours rest. I woke up just after 2 a.m. and grabbed my bottle of water from the nightstand. That's when I noticed the door was closed, even though I specifically requested it to stay open. And then there was that horrendous smell. I knew it was close. It was in the room. It was crouched down in the corner on all fours, blending into the darkness, watching me. I desperately tried to scream, but no sound would come out. Keeping my eyes on it, I slowly climbed out of the bed with my back pressed firmly against the wall. I knew it couldn't move if I didn't look away. I sidestepped along the wall towards the door. I started to maneuver around a set of drawers, knocking something off that caught my eye for a millisecond. But that's all it took. It was now standing on its 2 legs. It must have been 8 feet tall with outstretched limbs. A streak of moonlight illuminated part of its pale blue face. Its yellow eyes glistened in the light. Its slimy tentacles spread up the wall and onto the roof. I kept my back to the wall and kept moving. I made it to the door, grabbed the door handle, but it was locked. I kicked the door, but nobody could hear me. I could see the key for the door on the table in my peripheral. I fumbled around on the table without looking. I grabbed everything but the key. I knew I had to look to find the key. I quickly glanced to my left, saw the key, looked back, and the creature was point blank in front of me, reaching out for my throat. Its black, curved talon had pierced my neck, and blood trickled down. Somehow, I managed to scream, and within seconds 2 orderlies had barged through the door. All they found was me, alone with blood trickling down my neck. I barged straight past them and ran as fast as I could out of the hospital. I ended up running all the way home. I banged as loud as I could on the door, forgetting that it was almost 3:30 in the morning. Scott answered the door in his pajamas with a worried look plastered across his face. I told him what had happened at the hospital whilst he bandaged my neck. See, this is proof that what I'm seeing is real. This is physical proof. You believe me, right? You have to. I barked. After a momentary pause, he replied, yes, I believe you. I believe you're seeing something. I registered the pause and the hesitation in his voice. He didn't believe me, and I didn't blame him. After talking for a few hours, I had calmed down enough that I told Scott to get some sleep. He was reluctant to leave me, so he took a nap in the chair. I grabbed my laptop and searched the web for anything related to what was happening to me. There are thousands of incidents across the world relating to haunted houses, demons, cults, and possessions, but none that was specific to the entity that was stalking me. Every time I heard a sound, a car outside or a floorboard creak, I jumped. I was a nervous wreck. I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. I looked out of the window into the darkness, expecting to see it watching me, but it wasn't. I went back into the room, and it was there. I dropped the glass, and it shattered on the floor. Scott leaped from the chair. What is it? I couldn't speak. My lips were glued shut. I slowly raised my hand and pointed at it. It was standing at the far end of the room. I kept my eyes on it the entire time. Scott rushed over to me. Hey, Chloe, there's nothing there, sweetheart. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. He headed towards it. No, Scott, please don't, I pleaded as I grabbed his arm. He shrugged it off and marched over to it. There's nothing here. I'm going to prove it to you, he said. He cocked his arm back and swung his fist. Only his arm stopped mid-swing. He hit the creature. I moved to grab Scott and stood barefoot on the broken shards of glass, cutting my feet. I screamed out, and for a split second, I looked down, and that's all it took. When I looked up, the creature had already grabbed Scott and folded him in half like a piece of paper. The sound of his spine breaking echoed through the room. Scott lay dead on the floor, his eyes wide and open, and looking at me. I screamed and backed away into the kitchen. I slammed the door shut and ran to the rear door. It was locked, and I'd left my keys in my bag in the front room. I noticed Scott's cell on the countertop, so I grabbed it and ran down into the basement. I shut the door and pushed the spare fridge in front of it, and then I hid in the corner, crouched down beside the washing machine, which is where I am now, hiding, crying. I can't call anyone because Scott's cell doesn't have a signal down here, which is why I'm recording this message on his cell in the hopes that someone will hear my story. I can hear it now, moving around upstairs. It knows my eyes will be watching the door, so it's looking for another way in. I'm so scared. I'm the reason Scott's dead, my true love, and I'll never forgive myself for that. The thought of that is far worse than anything that monster can do to me. Oh God, it's here, the old laundry chute. God damn it, what the hell are you? It's watching me with those horrifying yellow eyes. I can't keep running because it'll find me, and I won't put anyone else in danger. It's me that it wants. Scott, I'm so sorry. I love you so much. And Mom, I love you so much. I'm going to close my eyes now. 3, 2, 1. That's it. That's the recording. It's very disturbing to me. If only you could hear her voice. She was terrified. The police haven't been back in contact as I write this, and I'm not expecting them to either. The woman mentioned her mother in the recording. I might try and find her tell her what I found, just in case the police don't believe it. I've been obsessing over this bit of family history lately, and a friend referred this place to me as a community that loves the mysterious and potentially supernatural, so I think you'll find this interesting. First, a history lesson. My great-grandfather and his brother were privates in the 5th Battalion of the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment in the First World War. Now, one of the lesser discussed contributions to the war effort was the General Post Office pulling off possibly the greatest feat of postal infrastructure that had yet been witnessed in history, transmitting literally millions of letters back and forth between the front lines daily. Mail carriers from the reps delving into hell and back time and time again just to make their appointed rounds. They're often made fun of in the modern internet era, but the truth is, couriers have pretty much been hardcore badasses forming the backbone for all of human history. Unfortunately, censorship was tight. Officers opened and checked every single one of their men's letters, not just to check for confidential war information, but also to make sure they weren't saying anything that contradicted the war propaganda or constituted a threat to public morale. Basically, unless you acted like the front lines were as peaky as a summer camp, your letter was liable to go right into the bin. My great-grandfather apparently tried to send many letters, but few made it through. It was likely officers of his own unit confiscated most of them, so they were probably left to rot in some trench. But he did one day feel either brave or desperate enough to try to sneak one by in what they called an honor envelope or green envelope. These were special and infrequently allotted envelopes which were, supposedly, delivered without censorship, so long as the sender vowed to mention only personal matters under threat of harsh punishments. Unlike regular correspondence, only a tiny fraction of green envelopes were opened up and combed over by staff back at base. Unfortunately, this letter was one of those terribly unlucky ones. Most confiscated letters were just destroyed. In many cases, their senders were given no notice their mail had even been withheld, although the lack of a reply usually made it obvious. After the war effort was over, many surviving confiscated letters were given over to archives for the education of future generations, and a few others even found their way, at long last, to their original intended recipient, if they were still alive to receive it. That is how my great-great-grandmother came to finally be delivered the last letter he ever sent, many years after his death. My family hoped that it would maybe comfort her, offer her some closure over the deaths of her sons, which she never seemed to quite recover from. Instead, whatever was in that letter only mortified her, and she claimed to have had it burned. She passed away from heart complications not too long after. My grandmother said it was a bittersweet day, sad as it was to see her go. She'd lived a long life, and they were sure she was overjoyed to finally rejoin her husband and sons in the ever after. Imagine our surprise, though, when my mother dug up the original letter tucked away in a drawer of scattered documents while cleaning out the attic of the old family estate. The old iron gall ink was so faded over the years, we had to visit a photographer's shop just to be able to carefully piece together the full letter under their UV light setup. We expected some sentimental goodbyes, some waxing philosophical about the insanity of war, you know, the usual. We couldn't have been more wrong. My family's been bandying about possible explanations for the letter for years now. Most agree that it was probably a dream, or maybe some sort of hypnagogic hallucination brought on by the stress of combat. Another theory is that he'd made it all up entirely as some sort of artistic statement. He had been a published author before the war, after all, and his purple prose seems implausible for someone describing a mind-shattering trauma. Still, nothing makes complete sense to me. He must have had some notion these may be his last words, a final opportunity to relay what happened to his brother and say goodbye to his mother. Would he really waste them on something that wasn't true? No matter how many times I read over my grandfather's words, it always makes me wonder, perhaps he really did see something down there in those blood-soaked trenches. I'll let you judge for yourself. To my mother, Henry died yesterday. My mind quivers with the memory of those leaden volleys bursting through his chest like a needle pierces a vein. The blood's faded now, but I can still feel the little red droplets, like they're still warm upon my cheeks. I wish I could tell you he cried out your name in the last but in truth, he was simply gone, extinguished in the instant of a muzzle flash, existence having clawed its way, baying and writhing, up from oblivion, to taste from the waters of life for a trifling moment before being once more consumed by those deep black seas of nothingness. That was all I could see before the gas flooded the trenches once more, and I could only flee, wailing, past the twisted bodies of my countrymen, as the gas consumed them, red veins bulging thickly over jaundiced flesh like strings pulled taut over a violin, figures fading, twisting, peeling, bulging, faces wide-eyed, open-mouthed, but silent. I wish I could tell you that these horrors shook me to my core, but I have become inoculated to them to an extent that frightens even myself. The war proceeds like a blurred, an abstract haze around me, each day indistinguishable from the next, dispensing its horrors like a machine, unthinking, unfeeling in its destruction of life. Though he was my brother, his loss failed to shake me, and his name died out on my lips just like it did my countrymen's. Indeed, the true horror did not set in upon his death, but rather upon his return. It was during the twilight hours beneath the waning moon that I alone sat alert, watching the moonlight dance a waltz with the wisps of fog, like spiny gray fingers stretching up from the turgid soil. One night I caught a glimpse of movement from one of the piles of bodies littering the no man's land beyond the trenches. Words cannot express the horror that assailed me when I beheld my own brother crawling from the charred pile with an inhuman lurch. His jaw was slack, clinging to his pale face by scarlet strings of tendons, his eyes whirling with an implacable, cloudy mist of white, emptied of feeling as he limped obstinately through the battle-scarred fields, even as his pierced chest used a black ichor. For too long, this campaign has left me sleepwalking through life, without passion, yet this sight was a grand exigency, lifting me to my feet as if stirring me from some terrible trance. I followed, creeping through the trenches, peering up over the battlements, not daring to make the faintest sound. As I observed the grim procession of the thing which was once our dear Henry, the battlefield was more quiet than it had ever been, not a sound audible over the gentle weaving of the wind through the branches of trees, until at last my ears picked up the faintest traces of music. My mind recoiled, picking apart the sound, as if unable to accept it as anything more than a flight of fantasy, but the tune persisted, draped over the battlefield like a warm blanket, filling my heart with terror and awe in equal measures, until, at last, I reached the very border of the trenches, and had followed Henry as far as I was able. I peered up at him a final time, and my hand is quivering now, as if it's committing some mortal sin just by immortalizing this blasphemous sight in ink. There was some uncountable legion of them, their forms nebulous and abstract, as they darted in and out of the swelling fog. There were Russians, and Germans and Austrians all in communion, and some were more ancient still, man-at-arms from ever more distant and primitive times, cross-time, and nationality, all were united in the primeval dance of war, whooping and wailing as they cavorted across the battlefield, pale flesh clinging to brittle bones. Henry, or what remained of him, locked arms with the promenade of the dead as if they were old friends, his face twisted into some noiseless caricature of laughter. My mind struggled most of all to comprehend the ever more monstrous silhouette they danced around in undying supplication, their twisted bodies connected to the great beast with scarlet strings. It was a cyclopean creature, 1,000 faces bulging from its malformed flesh, their features blackened by shadow. Said flesh had been torn through in scattered patches, revealing only a burning, undying fire raging in its hollow belly, from which the faint cacophony of battle could be heard. And in its many hands, it clutched the instruments of war, from glittering swords and rotting firearms all the way down to the bloodied stone that had felled Abel some eons ago. I watched as if spellbound, unable to so much as breathe, as their waltz unfolded before me, until at last, their dancing slowed, and the entity unhinged its rapacious maw. 2 by 2, the young men goose stepped into the thing's jaws, driven by some unholy sense of duty to allow their existences to be snuffed out without feeling, without ceremony, their names never again to be uttered by a human soul. It was at that moment I awoke in the trenches, as if roused from some grand and terrible dream, but no dream could match the vividness of what I beheld beneath that callous moon. I do not know why I write this. I know these letters never reach you, Mother. Perhaps I write this out of some vain hope to relieve myself of being alone in what I had witnessed in those final moments. as, just moments before stepping into that darkened maw, Henry turned and let his pearly eyes meet with mine, raising a rotted finger, and he beckoned to me with a twisted smile, not formed of malice, but of love. It was at that moment that I knew I would never again see your face, never again soak in the fragrance of your cooking, and the chirping of whip pigeons in the cabin I had once called home. If you ever see this, I am so sorry, dearest mother, but the morning your children stepped into these boiling trenches, war already had us clutched in her pallid hand, dangling us above the fire for but a few futile moments until it was time for us to join her in her immortal dance. With love, Jay. My grandfather didn't survive long enough to be court-martialed for trying to sneak this letter by. He went missing in action while fighting in the Second Battle of Ypres before his letter even reached London. His body was never recovered, but his name is still immortalized on the Menin Gate Memorial. To the missing, may we all pray that the world is never racked by another war of such a scale again. This summer, I decided to get my DNA sequenced by 23andMe. I wanted to know my ancestry as well as find out if I'm a carrier for any genetic disorders, since my husband and I want to try and get pregnant soon. When the results came back, everything was what I expected. I was Romanian and German. I had the sun sneeze reflex, etc. The surprise came when I clicked on the relatives tab. At the top of the list, it showed my parents. Except there weren't two parents, there were three. John T., father, 50.0% DNA shared. Agnes T., mother, 50.0% DNA shared. G., mother, 50.0% DNA shared. I stared at the last one. What? I scrolled up and down the list, but the rest looked normal. One of my brothers came up, along with an aunt and some cousins. Curious, I clicked on G's profile, but there wasn't any other information. To see details, like her ancestry or shared relatives, I'd need to connect with her. Probably just a glitch or something. Or maybe my mom made two accounts by accident. I closed my laptop and tried to forget about it, but for the rest of the day, it bothered me, like a little itch in the back of my brain. Maybe it isn't a duplicate account or a total glitch. Maybe she's some secret aunt or something, and 23andMe just overestimated the shared DNA. I'd read the horror stories of 23andMe uncovering family secrets like that, so that evening I decided to hit connect. I didn't really expect her to accept, but just a few days later she did. I went over to the 23andMe website, my heart pounding. When I scrolled down, I saw my ancestry composition and G's side by side. Her ancestry looked like my mom's, almost 100% Romanian, but it was slightly different. My heart pounded faster. I opened 3 tabs, my mom's ancestry, my dad's, G's, and mine. My eyes darted between them, comparing them, studying them, and after several minutes, I realized it. I was 1% Scandinavian, but neither my mother nor my father had any Scandinavian ancestry. Only G did. A chill went down my spine. I stared at G's profile, at her empty profile picture. Who is she? I told my husband all about it. He thought I was overreacting. It's just some glitch, he said as he flipped the chicken on the stove. 23andMe must have sequenced the DNA wrong, or mixed up the samples, or something. It's creepy though, isn't it? Yeah, I guess. He opened the cabinet, rummaging around for plates, but there's just so much room for error with that DNA stuff. I tried not to think about it, but my night was plagued with nightmares of G, a faceless woman calling from the forest, who had my long dark hair and tall stature, a second mother who, somehow, had given me her DNA. When I woke up, though, I realized something. If I shared 50% of my DNA with my father and my mother and G, well, 50% plus 50% plus 50% did not equal 100%. One of my parents had to share DNA with G. I called my mom on the way to work. Did you see anyone listed in your DNA relatives named G? I asked, as I pulled onto the highway. G, she repeated. Yeah, there's just a person named G who keeps popping up on my DNA relatives. I don't think so, she replied, but I don't know. The website is kind of hard to use. Brandon was helping me with it. Could you ask? Yeah, sure. Gotta go now, though. With that being a dead end, I decided to bite the bullet and send G a message. Most likely, it'd be some big misunderstanding. G was probably some stranger living on the other end of the country with no connection to me whatsoever. Hey, I noticed 23, and me listed you as a relative. Do you have any family members with the last name T or K, especially in the Northwest US? Are you related to my mother, Agnes T? The response came less than an hour later, and when I read it, a slow chill ran down my spine. You will find out soon enough. That was the whole thing, the whole response, those cryptic 6 words. I quickly shot a message back. Are you related to me or my mom? No answer. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Then, in one swift motion, I moved my cursor up and removed her as a connection. Just a troll, a scammer, something weird like that. A few days later, I checked 23 and me again to find that G had removed her account, or possibly that the glitch had been fixed because G was no longer listed as my mother or a relative at all. Weeks went by and I forgot about the whole thing. Work got busy, gardening season was in full swing, and my hours were spent either working late in the office or slaving over my plant babies. I didn't even give G a second thought until one morning it all came crashing down. 2 pink lines. My husband and I spent the morning crying, hugging each other, overjoyed about this little person we would bring into the world, until I went to the mailbox. Inside was a folded piece of pink paper tied off with black ribbon. No stamp, it must have been hand-delivered. My throat went dry as I flipped it open and read the words on the page. Meet me at D, park at midnight tonight. G. I took the day off work. I'd barely slept. I kept thinking she was going to come back. When I finally got up for the day, though, I realized the situation was probably a lot less creepy than I thought. She wasn't some long-lost relative or Rumpelstiltskin baby stealer. She was under the influence of drugs or suffering from mental illness. Those were the only explanations. Of course, that didn't explain the DNA results or how she knew I was pregnant, but I forced all those nagging questions out of my head and tried to move forward. By the afternoon, I was feeling much better about the whole thing. Then the bleeding began, and my entire world came to a stop. I began to sob. No, 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 I can't lose the baby. I can't. My mom had told me once about the miscarriage she'd had before my brothers and I were born, how it had nearly destroyed her. I thought I'd understood how horrible that was for her. But now, as I sat there staring at the smear of blood on toilet paper, I knew I hadn't really understood. Until now. I called Danny. He left work immediately. We called the doctor and they told me to go on bed rest. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. They won't be able to save your baby. She knew I was pregnant. She knew my baby was going to be lost forever. She wasn't just some crazy woman. She knew. The shrill ring of my phone snapped me out of my daze. I grabbed it and my heart leapt as I saw the name on the screen. Mom, I cried. I've been trying to call you all day. Before she could say much else, I told her everything. The pregnancy, G visiting in the middle of the night, trying to break in, and the impending miscarriage. Kayla, she started, and there was something about her voice that made my heart drop. You need to find her. What? There's so much I haven't told you. Her voice shook as she spoke. Her name is Grezel. She came to me when I was 8 weeks pregnant with you. The doctors were having trouble finding your heartbeat, and I thought I was going to have another miscarriage. She offered me a deal. She would be able to save you, but in return, you would carry some of her DNA. I don't know how she did it. I don't know why. I just knew that I was scared and desperate and willing to do anything to save you, even if it sounded completely crazy. I met her in the woods. We did this sort of, I don't even know, a blood ritual. That's the best way I can describe it. I don't believe in witchcraft or anything like that, but whatever she did, it worked. A few days later, when I went to my appointment, you were fine. I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. I was frozen, with the phone up to my ear, heart racing in my chest. Wait, the gears spinning in my head finally caught. But she has to be related to you. The DNA test said I'm 50% you, and Dad, and her, so there's got to be overlap. I don't know anything about that, she said. I just know that she'll save the baby, but I have no way of contacting her. What if she doesn't come back? I pause. Then she'll come back. After the call, I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process everything she told me. Why did Grezel share DNA with my mom? Did she somehow steal it during the blood ritual? Maybe she was some sort of inhuman creature that needed to suck DNA off everyone else. Maybe that was the trade. This was starting to sound like some twisted fairy tale, one of the uncensored ones where everyone dies horribly. My mom was right. A few hours later, I was interrupted from my thoughts with a loud thump, thump, thump on the front door. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, but when I swung the door open, Grezel wasn't standing there. Instead, there was another piece of pink paper, scribbled in black marker, were the words, "Meet me in the woods behind the mall at midnight. Come alone." Gee, the forest was dark. I heard the chittering of bats overhead, somewhere, as they swept through the air for their nightly meal. The leaves crunched under my feet as I continued further in. Just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw her, a dark silhouette, standing in a small clearing off to my right, wearing a long, black gown that draped so effortlessly over her body it looked like it was made of shadow. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, cascaded down her back. "Grezel," I called out. She turned around. Her skin was so pale in the moonlight, it looked like it almost glowed. "I see you've decided to join me. Can you save the baby?" Her lips twisted into a crooked smile. "Yes," she crooned. "Come closer." I slowly stepped towards her, my heart hammering in my chest. Up close, I realized she appeared older than I thought she was. Deep wrinkles cut her face, crinkling around her eyes. And her eyes, there was something off about them. Her irises were pure black, and they were too large, giving them an almost bug-like appearance. "Are you ready to begin?" I nodded. She pulled a knife from the folds of her dress. The silver blade glinted in the moonlight. She smiled at me, crookedly, and drew it along her palm. Then she grabbed my right hand, turned it over. I let out a soft cry of pain as she dug the blade into my skin. Dark blood bloomed out of the wound, glinting in the moonlight. Then she pressed her palm against mine. A tingle of pain shot up my arm. I could feel it, feel something, traveling up my veins and deeper into my body. Then it dissipated, and we were standing there together, staring at each other in the darkness. "Your child will live," she whispered, "and they'll be okay. You're not going to take them from me, or did I take you from your mother?" I shook my head. She turned around, her black dress swirling around her. "We are done here." But something didn't sit right with me. It was too easy. What did Grezel get out of all this? My DNA. Why would she want to save my baby? Just to genetically be their mother, not to steal them or raise them as her own. "Wait," I called out. "There's got to be something you're getting out of this." She turned back towards me, her wild dark hair falling in front of her face. "What's the catch? Tell me. I don't want to spend my whole life dreading it." She paused, her smile growing wider, and then she spoke. "Your children will carry my DNA. So will your brother's children, and so will your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren. My DNA will lay dormant in them, spreading silently, generation by generation." Her smile grew wider. "Then, one day, when I am ready, my soldiers will come out of dormancy, and we will reclaim the forests and rivers, the earth that you destroyed, the earth that belongs to the Fae." Then she turned on her heel and walked deeper into the forest until the shadows swallowed her up. I'll be writing in a flowery language at times. It is one of few ways I can deal with my affliction. Great many things can set it off, language being one of the first and foremost. So by expressing myself in unusual ways, I don't fall into common mental pathways. You will understand. So let's talk about it. The twice mind fallacy. Some of you have heard of it. I don't think the results were ever published. They wouldn't allow it. But those who know, they know. I studied clinical psychology at an average Midwestern college. My tuition was mostly supplemented by my parents, but I had to work to get anything past the bare minimum necessities. I worked at a local gas station for a while, but the manager got weird when I asked to work night hours. Apparently, they got a thing about working the night shift. I got word from a classmate that one of the tenured professors spent most of his time conducting social experiments. One such experiment was featured in one of the mandatory textbooks. Damn thing set me back $180. Okay, wait, less slang. Hold on, I'm bringing it back. Salivate, nutritious. Got it. So I signed up for the big spring experiment. It paid $70 per session, and there were 1 to 2 sessions depending on how your participation went. There was also an additional $40 for those agreeing to come back for a debriefing once the experiment was over. Apparently, there'd be some kind of big public reveal. But first, there was an orientation session. I read through the disclaimer and entered my personal information on their website. Boilerplate stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. They even had a non-legalese version for me to read, basically agreeing that they were entitled to the results of the experiment up until the point where, and if I withdrew my consent. Also some attesting to my state of mind and general mental health. Those are a must in many social experiments. At the first orientation session, I was put in a waiting room with 6 other people. I'd seen some of them around campus. I think one of them was a computer science major. A preppy young man shook my hand and showed me a private room, a small, windowless room with all yellow walls and a plastic table, the kind of table you usually keep outdoors that feels like it'd collapse if you put too much weight on it. Very cheap overall. Thanks for coming, he said. Let's see what we're working with. All right, I nodded. Don't really know what to expect here. So you are Jess Goff Hannon, he said. I can see that you. There was a rush of adrenaline coursing through me. Revealing someone else's records was a big no-no. My left hand shot up like a flare, like my body was trying to physically silence them. No, I interrupted. No, that's not me. None of that. That's not me. The young man looked up, slack-jawed, ping-ponging back and forth between me and his notes. He seemed to have completely lost his train of thought. Yeah, he smiled. Right, how embarrassing. He quickly found my notes and went through them. Name, age, address, family history, what I'd signed up with on the form. Took about a minute. He kept looking up at my apologetically, probably hoping that I'd just forget about that stupid name drop. I had to wait 45 minutes before the first real session started. I was shown a second room, this one much larger, with this 72nd style patterned wallpaper, a corner couch, and 2 massage chairs. That's when I first met Dr. Stanson. Formally, Dr. Stanson had a fantastic track record. One of his most notable contributions was his field studies in what later became the overexposure therapeutic method. He was very proud of it, sporting an image where he posed with his co-writer, Dr. Jane Bogan, on the university website. To meet Dr. Stanson in person was an absolute honor. There was just the 2 of us in that room, and having his full attention bear down on me was a bit overwhelming. This was a man who'd been asking questions for 30 years, and now he was aiming them straight at me. But it all started with a handshake. Thank you for coming, he smiled. Please, have a seat. We had a bit of small talk about his past accomplishments and the study overall. He couldn't divulge too much information, not wanting to spoil the experiment, but he assured me that it was meant as a diagnostics tool. For what, he didn't say. He had a recorder in the room, but seemed to forget to switch it on. I got the impression that he wasn't really taking things seriously. I'm going to ask you to do a simple hand movement, he said, starting with your index fingers. He hooked his index fingers and put his elbows out. I mimicked his movement, and he gave me a nod. Next, try to interlock your ring fingers as well. I did, trying my best to get a tight grip. Finally, point your little fingers outwards. Their tips should be less than an inch apart, but they can't touch. Can you do that? It took a bit of trickery, but I could. It was an awkward pose to keep, and Dr. Stanson made some quick notes on his tablet. Now, I want you to slowly start pulling. Not so much that it hurts, but enough for you to exert yourself. Alright, I started pulling. You can't really win in this pose, you just sort of maintain a position. The pulling is just adding strain. There's no hand giving or losing ground. Now I need you to listen carefully. It was almost like hypnosis, and I can't remember his exact words. But in short, he wanted me to imagine the 2 hands separately, to imagine my left hand being connected to an unknown hand on the right, and to imagine my right hand being connected to an unknown hand on the left. Basically to slowly separate my thoughts into left and right, but keeping them both contained in my head simultaneously. He used this vivid imagery: 2 fish swimming in a bucket, neither touching the other but feeling the current. 2 birds in the night, resting on the same branch, both feeling the weight of the other without seeing them. It was very poetic language, sounding very unacademic. Short break. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Let me just type this out. Granular, top-notch, effervescent, Picking strange words helps. It must be unfamiliar, uncomfortable, odd. After a while, I could feel it taking hold. It became a struggle once I dissociated my hands with one another. It didn't become a balancing act, but instead a competition. I could feel my left being frustrated by the dominance of my right. Finally, without even realizing it, my left hand was also pushing, using the thumb. That wasn't allowed, but I got so caught up in the moment. I was pressing down on a nerve on my right hand, actually causing myself pain. Not much, but I could feel it. Still, part of me enjoyed it. I was winning. But the other side of me was frustrated because of the disregard to the established rules. In time, Stanson announced, "Thank you very much for your participation." I tried to let go, but neither hand wanted to quit. I had to mentally tell myself to stop, to put both hands down in unison. "How long has it been?" I asked. "About 10 minutes, smiled Stanson. "I know, time flies." I couldn't believe it. It had felt like hours. As I left, another student stepped in to take my place. The young man in the reception wished me a good day and told me we'd keep in touch. I was a bit dumbfounded, feeling like I'd been sort of just dropped. If there was to be a follow-up session, it'd be in a couple of days, but until then I had to deal with my feelings on my own. And my feelings, at that point, were complex. I didn't know what to feel, but I knew that I felt different. I drove back home and took the stairs up to my apartment, still flipping my car keys back and forth in my left hand. Then, I heard a clatter. I saw the keys tumble down the stairs, but I hadn't felt myself dropping them. I flexed my left hand a few times, but couldn't feel any strange sensations. I walked back down the stairs, picked up my keys, and that was that. Over the next few days, I had a few similar incidents. Accidentally tapping too many times on my phone, adding an extra vowel or two while writing, that kind of stuff. The worst was when my hand refused to let go of a glass of water, making me spill half of it all over my keyboard. Luckily, my nearby $180 textbook came away unscathed. I was called in for a second session. I was a bit relieved. I was eager to get a chance to talk to Dr. Stanson about what I'd been experiencing, if only to hear whether it was normal or not. Maybe I was just imagining things. But Dr. Stanson wasn't there for the second session. Instead, I sat down with his assistants. One assistant stayed in the back, taking notes. I tried asking them questions, but they kept repeating that I'd get my chance to talk to Dr. Stanson at a later date, and that they were not at liberty to discuss the experiment as is. So for the second session, they asked me to do the same movement. I interlocked my hands, listened, and got this sudden sense of unease bubbling up in my stomach. Like I was doing something wrong, something immoral. It was the same kind of sensation you get when you're publicly naked in a dream, that you're exposed and vulnerable. I didn't like it, not one bit, and in that moment of uncertainty, just a few seconds into the session, my hand slammed down on the table, bruising the knuckle of my right index finger. I shot out of my chair, clutching my hand. I bit down hard and swore, having pinched a nerve. I got this electric pain shooting right down the arch of my wrist. The assistants looked at me like they'd seen a ghost. "Are you alright?" they asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't feel normal. I'm calling it off," the assistant said, getting out of his chair. His colleague put her hand on his shoulder. "No, we're not. This is unrelated." I got some time to cool down, and I tried again. I had to put up an actual struggle this time. My left hand felt so much stronger than my right, and I could imagine myself wrestling a superior opponent. I was actually sweaty, and watched my left hand for tricks. There'd be no slip of the thumb, nothing that broke the rules. I wouldn't be surprised a second time. We only did this exercise for a few minutes, then they moved on to different tests, playing a game of tic-tac-toe, but closing my eyes for 30 seconds between each move while associating the circle with my left hand and the X with my right hand. Circle left, X right. Bear with me. I'm typing this part with just my right hand. It comes and goes. Sometimes that doesn't work either. Thumb, palm breaths, oligarch, balsamic, sedentary. Hold on. Okay. When I left the second session, I was dead set on seeing Dr. Stanson again. I told them I wouldn't do any further sessions until I did, and that I was ready to quit the experiment altogether. One of the assistants, the one who'd protested, just left the room. The other seemed a bit more hesitant. "He's in charge of the debrief," she said. You can see him then. This is urgent, I said. I'm not doing well. There's a campus health center. I'm sure they can advise you. I wanted to slap her. It was just an impulse, but it was enough to send a contraction down my left arm. I managed to redirect it into a clap instead, which I promptly used as a sort of gesture to leave. For the next few days, it got increasingly worse. I started thinking about that name they'd said when I first signed up. Maybe there'd been a mix-up, and I was never meant to be there in the first place. Maybe this just Gov Hannon was the intended subject, and I was a mistake. Or maybe this was meant to happen all along. Maybe this was the experiment. Dr. Stanson had a record of mind-bending social experiments, and this could have been the power of suggestion. I could be the victim of my own imagination. That night, as I went to sleep, I found myself twisting and turning. I kept losing my covers, and there was a constant chill going up the left side of my body. I had this half-waking nightmare about a second head growing out of my left shoulder, my ribcage expanding and splitting like a cell dividing. I felt myself clawing at the side of my body like a wounded animal trying to push its guts back inside. I tried crawling out of bed, sweat stinging my open eyes. Something was holding me back. My left arm, cramped and bloodless, digging into the wood of the headboard. Having twisted and turned all night, it was getting late. Minutes before the break of dawn, I lay awake staring into the ceiling, feeling my mind slip out of my grasp. Like a part of my thoughts were bleeding out of my head, drenching the pillow with my emotions and memories. I blinked, one eye at a time. I had trouble breathing, not knowing when to swallow my spit and when to inhale. I tried biting my dry tongue to feel something. All I felt was the bitter taste of iron biting back. Just Goth Hannon, I mouthed out. Just Goth Hannon. I felt my left hand release. There was a tingling sensation as blood started rushing back, tensing my muscles, causing a spasmic reaction. That's you, I said. That's it, isn't it? An arch of pain as a nerve twisted. No, I groaned. That's us. Instant relief. Sweet, healing relief. To someone from the outside, what happened next can seem insane. I know. For the first time since the first session, I started having full control of all my faculties. No more dropped keys. All I had to do was think clearly about asking for permission. There was never a response, but just thinking about it was enough. There was nothing I wasn't given permission to do as long as I thought about asking. Just Goth Hannon. Just acknowledging their presence made everything so much easier. But every now and then, intrusive thoughts crept in. I started thinking about calling for help, about talking to someone, about doing something, and Jess, retaliated. By now, this foreign pain in my left arm had reached the lower parts of my shoulder, pushing at the edges of my heart. Even thinking about doing something bad would make my pulse soar. At one point, it made my heart literally skip a beat. I had to lean against the wall to catch my breath. One thing I noticed early on was that thinking about it in flowery language seemed to help. I started reading a thesaurus on my phone whenever I wanted to plan something out in my head, and it gave a sense of relief. Somewhat, but looking away too long made my left hand either close the tab or throw the entire phone away. It broke eventually, but I could run circles around myself. For example, if I wanted to think about seeing a doctor, I would instead think of consulting a licensed physician. I'd still feel a tinge of something, but nothing bad. It started to feel like a presence crawling through the back of my mind, little burning sentries looking for familiar brain signals to grasp. Using exotic wordplay and an outlandish vocabulary would pull them off the trail. Hence why I sometimes bring up irregular words to pull my mind in different directions. Problem was, I couldn't control my dreams. And in my dreams, I wanted out, and I wanted whatever this was to go away. Every night was a battle. I'd get slapped awake or find myself struggling to breathe. My left lung would shut down, or I'd get a stomach cramp. Once, my left leg started to twist and turn, straining itself to the point where I thought the kneecap might get dislocated. I tried pleading. I tried explaining out loud that I wasn't consciously doing something bad, that I was only trying to sleep, to relax. But in the labyrinth of my mind, I could sense that strange presence growing, making space for itself. And for the first time, it spoke back to me, using only the left side of my mouth. It whispered, I wanu. It pulled to the left so hard I fell off the bed, and every time I was close to falling asleep, and those stress dreams took over, I'd be pulled back awake again and again and again. I don't know how I survived the next few days. One morning I just woke up in my shower, fully clothed and shivering. My fingers were blue. My left hand kept squeezing an empty shampoo bottle. "Jess," I tried to say. "Jess, please." "Wanu," I twitched. "Wanu, we can see Dr. Stanson. He can help us." A hiss escaped my throat, burning into my vocal cords. They were in accord. I was allowed to check the posted lecture schedules on my laptop. Dr. Stanson had a single lecture that day, right before lunch. I had about an hour to get there. I changed my pants, put on a jacket, and left. I didn't even lock the front door. "Wanu," I mouthed. He could do something. He had to. Whatever it was, he could do it. By the time I made my way back to the university, my left side wasn't playing along. One leg was walking faster than the other, and my hand kept grabbing and punching things. I kept making these strange noises, like I was lifting heavy weights or trying to cough up a hairball. I didn't care. I just had to see Dr. Stanson. Finally, I stumbled into the lecture hall. I was 10 minutes late, but so be it. I was shocked to see that this wasn't an ordinary lecture. This was the debriefing for the experiment I'd been a part of. My phone was broken. I probably missed all their calls and texts. Maybe they thought I'd quit. I had trouble focusing. I saw another student, the computer science major, sitting just a few rows ahead. He seemed fine. Was this just me? There was a burst of laughter. Apparently, Dr. Stanson had just said something funny, humorous, whimsical, droll, stay in control. The Raskian identity theory revolves around the idea formulaic identity. Stanson smiled. So for my 30th year of teaching academia, I figured I'd indulge myself with some pseudoscience, if only to put these ridiculous notions to rest. So for those of you looking to pursue a serious career, look away. Another round of laughter. So for the sake of argument, we followed the suggested method to point and order, and it required 3 steps. And right then and there, Stanson laid out the entire experiment to the sound of laughter and applause. First step was to introduce the trigger word, usually a strange name, an identifier, something unique that would open new pathways in the patient's mind. He did this by faking a mistake during the interview process, all in good fun. Second step was to open vessel space by creating a mental separation, a vacuum. This was done by a series of physical and mental exercises. Again, Stanson made light of things, pulling fingers and making people play tic-tac-toe with themselves. It was based on the ideas of the original author, but made ridiculous. Out of 80 people we tested, 58 couldn't stop themselves from laughing, so we had some trouble getting them to follow along, chuckled Stanson. Out of the remaining 22, 13 had trouble understanding the instructions. 5 had some kind of arm or hand injury, making one side reliably dominant. The remaining 4 were the most interesting. One got so into it they slammed their hand into the table, frightening poor Patricia here. Another sensible chuckle rose from the audience. Stanson could be quite charismatic when he wanted to. The third step is a strange one, he continued. It's basically just waiting. Once a seed has been planted, there is no guarantee that it blooms. It all depends on the seed, or the idea, and the soil, or the person. It's like typing a random name for a website and hoping you get something good. Most of the time you just get spam, or, well, naked people, or nothing. Stanson shrugged and clicked to the next slide. According to Rask, if performed regularly, you can eventually find and invite a name or concept that is so unique that it creates an identity, or that an identity was already associated with it. Like how the word for cat differs in language, but we all know what a cat looks like. That means the meaning of cat is transcendental, even though the word isn't. To Rask, modern language was broken model of an original intent, and that by exploring it we could stumble upon something more, something universal. He showed another slide, a seed, growing into a seedling, only to bloom into different flowers. Some turned to roses, others were petunias. One branch turned into a weird blue sunflower. Plant enough seeds, nodded Stanson, and eventually they might turn into something. That was the idea behind the twice mind fallacy, a routine to invite something. A hand shot up from the front row. Stanson pointed to it. What would happen if they made it through the third step? they asked. That's an interesting question, nodded Stanson. If Raskian identity theory is something to go by, they'd be inhabited by a foreign being, something not restricted by humanity, a completely alien entity, unrestricted and primal. Or a pig. Could be anything, really. Stanson changed slides, showing column after column after column of the various names he'd used in the experiment. Some were obvious fakes, like Charlie Chaplin or Abraham Lincoln. Others were just noises or jokes. One of the entries just read Toots McDougal, but by the end of the list I saw one I recognized. I'll admit, said Stanson, they ran out of stupid names, so we picked a few from Rask's diaries. He uses this weird name to describe a personification of his writer's block. We thought it fitting. He went on to speak about obscure references, like a man named Absten and some strange woman called Athosa, but it was the final name on the list that made my blood run cold. It didn't say Jeskov Hannon, it said Jezgoth, the have none. There was a little clip art demon in the corner. More laughter. I stood up, not by choice. My left hand dug into the seat in front of me, tearing a hole in the cheap imitation leather. My fingernails bled. At the same time, a bell rang. The lecture was over, and Stanson got a standing ovation for his presentation. I blended in with the crowd. This was a joke. This had all been a joke. My mouth drooled. Ave non. I tried to stand still as students pushed past me. Some stayed to talk to Dr. Stanson and congratulate him on his many achievements. The twice mind fallacy was meant as a footnote, a curio. It was never meant to be studied. It wasn't based on anything but the ramblings of an old poet. Rask was an early 20th century writer who mostly made children's books to keep his paranoia in check. This is getting harder, so I pushed forward. I got up to Stanson. I knocked over a table, sending papers and drawings tumbling into the air. Stanson recoiled, but I reached for him. Sadly, I reached with both arms at once, completely losing my balance. I fell over him, collapsing to the floor. Get it out, I spat. Ilyu, the other side of me growled. Ilyu, ilal, aveal. No, I groaned. I don't know where I got that pencil from, but all of a sudden, I had it, wielding it like a knife. Two people tried to pull me off Dr. Stanson. I heard a scream. Someone got that pencil burrowed into their thigh. I hugged myself, crossing my arms. I tried to wrestle myself. My head twitched back and forth, trying to say two things at once, in two voices. I had this intense ache in the back of my neck. As nerve endings started to fray, something pushed against my spine, and I could feel my skin stretching. I ended up lying there, screaming, my eyes flickering back and forth. And for a moment I had this sense of clarity, like I had stepped into the mind of another. It was only for a heartbeat, but it lasted for hours. I had this thought of an old man sitting by a table. He was bitter about having to dress up for his daughter's wedding. He watched through a window as an old horse pulled a cart down a cobblestone road. The old man did not approve of his daughter's union. Whenever there was a source of discontent in his life, he gave it a name, and this particular name recurred many times. Perhaps he grew less imaginative with age. He pondered. Jezgoth, the have none, the old man wrote. Jezgoth, untouched by Saul's embrace, unacquainted with the merciful solace of restful slumber. No witty phrases birthed from his quill, nor was he ever graced by a virgin smile. He is he, the one bereft of essence, who often mirrors my void when I dissolve into naught, becoming the embodiment of my silent tempest. A knock at the door causes the old man to sigh. He crumbles the page in his palm, leaving it abandoned in a corner of the room with dry flower petals and years of dusty neglect. He grabs his walking cane and surrenders to inconvenience. In that moment, I completely lost control. Left side, right side, all of it. I saw it play out in front of me, like watching a movie through a straw. One of the assistants got her nose broken as her glasses shattered. A clean hit to the face. I got a hold of Dr. Stanson and tried to strangle him with a mic cord, all the while screaming those few crude words my mouth could bring itself to form. Kill, want, have. Thinking those simple words makes my arm ache. I must careful. Someone called 911. Someone told them to hang up. It took 3 people to keep me pinned to the ground. I bit people, I scratched, I screamed. But also, I did nothing. Jezgoth had gotten so much space in me that there was barely anything of me left. I felt my lungs gasp for air, but I couldn't move them. I could only hope that my host was gracious enough to breathe. They were. They breathed me nice. Much of it is a blur. Jesgoth didn't pay much attention. I kept zoning out, waking intermittently from blackouts. Dr. Stanson was often there, telling people to stay quiet, threatening people. I remember hearing him scream that anyone saying anything about this would never write anything to anyone ever again. But in the back of my head, I was exploring the psyche of my assailant. Memories, thoughts, smells, and sights, all remnants of whatever this old poet toted down at the turn of the century. The personification of this bad thing, yes, bad thing, and it was turning me into a battleground. For days, it felt like walking through a dark forest. I'd open my eyes and see whatever Jesgoth wanted me to see, but in my mind's eye, I wandered the empty halls filled with the essence of this would-be creature. Sunless skies, expressionless people, identical square buildings circling a tower that pierces the heavens, endless dunes of gray sand, and withering patches of grass. And somewhere among the gloom, I saw Jesgoth, a joyless old man, sitting on his throne, lazily pointing a sword at me. At his discretion, he could pierce my heart, but he saw no point in doing so. There was no joy in killing, no rage to quench, no love to pursue. There were no songs to sing in the land of the have-nots. Somewhere in the darkness, there was a voice. Dramaturgy, it said. Remember that word, dramaturgy. Something clicked in me. My eyes opened, both at once. Yes, I nodded. Remember, I was in a dark room, somewhere off campus. Dr. Stanson hadn't slept for days. A room covered in notebooks, sketches, and crumbling prints of long-gone hand-written volumes. Half a dozen take-out boxes. A red tie casually thrown across the floor. Thank God, he sighed. Now listen to my words. Listen carefully. Not my voice, my words. He told me many smart words. Pretty words. Bad. Ugly. He specifically told me words like agency, willingness, effortless, and determined. Words with many syllables, who I was asked to consider the meaning of. Just like I'm doing now. Right now. Not just good words, or smart words, but words that reminded me that I have control of my own mental faculties. A capacity for me. Strong words that could push back and expunge the poison that drenched my soul. We spent hours droning the same repertoire, many of which I've repeated here. I stayed with Dr. Stanson for months. On paper, I was his research assistant. In reality, he was trying to cover it all up. He realized he'd made a terrible mistake, and he buried everything about the twice-mind fallacy. I didn't care, I just wanted that thing out of my head. One day, Stanson just didn't come back to the office. There was no explanation, and no one went looking for him. At every turn, I was stonewalled. Tight-lipped academics wearing secretive pins, taking payments for brand lectures that they never went to. I'm not going into it here, but pay attention to the Hatchet Investment Group. I left campus with a sizable donation from an anonymous donor and a reminder that some of the paperwork I'd signed when I joined the study was still relevant. I never got my degree in clinical psychology, but I don't think I want it anymore. I want to do something with my body, at least when I get full control back. As you have certainly noticed by now, I still have trouble staying. Well, me. There's not much left of Jesgoth. I think it is all in my left hand. I can feel it. Like a worm trying to snake its way up my veins. I've pushed it down over and over, but the poison must go. I wanted to write one last time, to fully, effortlessly write, because later tonight, I'm cutting this arm off, ending this nightmare once and for all. The old woman held my sleeve, her dark eyes smoldering. I froze, perplexed and somewhat uncomfortable. I'd come to the bazaar specifically for flowers, but among the narrow streets and courtyards I'd gotten lost. There hadn't been anyone around for ages. And now this. Well, she grinned a rotten smile, her face tanned and shriveled like worn leather. My first instinct was to pull free, and run, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was spellbound by the intoxicating scent trickling from her stall, cascading. Pungent aromas just as striking as the beautiful flowers decorating her walls. The colorful petals swayed alluringly in the wind, drawing me in. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, instantly transported to a faraway place of wild, unbroken beauty. Do you know him? Torn from my reverie, I shook my head. But you are looking for flowers, yes, yes. You see, I love flowers. I come from a long line of horticulturists. In fact, my village is famous for it. We host a yearly competition for the most beautiful blossom, drawing people from all over the world. Since I started, I've always finished top 3, having come second in the last 4 competitions. What's worse, my neighbor, that nag Karen, is the one keeping me from the grand prize, having won the last 6 competitions. Her skill is legendary, she's constantly lauded. It's maddening. It's not fair. That's why I came to this bazaar. My obsession having chased me to the most remote regions on earth in search for the perfect blossom. Show me your most beautiful flower, I demanded. The old woman shook her head. Tell me the purpose of your flower first. Purpose breeds beauty. A perfect blossom without meaning is impossible. I told her. The old woman's eyes lit up. She licked her dry lips and rubbed her hands excitedly. I have special flower just for you, gifted to me by a mystic long ago, plucked from the divine garden lost to men. Tall tales weren't abnormal in these bazaars. Fantastical objects, always magical, always priceless, but still ready to be bartered away for a couple dollars. And yet, I felt goosebumps listening to her tale. How much? The old woman shook her head and waved away the wallet in my hand. No price, except know this. That man, the man who smells of sunflowers, will come. I frowned and glanced at my watch. My flight would leave soon. There was no time for this superstitious nonsense. You accept? The old woman asked. Sure. After concluding our transaction, the old woman grabbed my hand. My people believe sacrifice is needed to bring out true vitality. It has long been a custom for this particular plant. In order to bring out its bloom, a drop of your adversary's blood. Blood is nectar of the gods. Only then will flower bloom beyond wildest imagination. I smiled awkwardly and nodded, if only to get the old woman to let go of me, turning around as soon as she did and hightailing it back to the airport. Back home, I immediately got to work, potting the seeds, carefully concocting a perfect mix of fertilizer and nutrients. 2 weeks passed, and nothing. No flower, no bloom, not even a tiny sprout. The truth slapped me in the face. I'd been swindled. The next days passed in a mix of fury and gut-wrenching anxiety, and though I still had a greenhouse full of flowers I'd carefully cultivated all year, timed to perfection to bloom during competition weekend, it was not enough. Every day, going and coming back from my salon, I drove past Karen's house. This time she'd even refrained from using a controlled greenhouse environment. Instead, she'd transformed her lawn into a single, breathtaking flower bed, a rich tapestry of color abuzz with life and fragrant vitality. None of my flowers could compete. It was unfair, like comparing Monet's gracefully dotted style to those done by a finger-painting toddler, and all that she'd freestyled, not just braving the outdoor weather conditions, but seemingly bending them to her will. Every time I drove by, a cold hand reached into my stomach, twisting my innards more and more, and then it was here. The Friday prelude to competition weekend, and just as she always did, Karen came to my salon. Beating me wasn't enough. She needed me to doll her up to do it first. Karen sat in silence for a while, leaving me to cut and pluck away. I like working with hair, because its upkeep is not all that dissimilar to gardening. You have to bring out the full beauty of what's there while pruning away the unwanted parts. As it always did, our conversation turned to pleasant gossip. Down the road, Tara's 16-year-old daughter got pregnant. It seemed the apple had not fallen far from the tree, and Sarah from the post office heard from her cousin, who's a nurse at the local hospital, that Tara had come in looking for information about abortions. The scandal, like I said, pleasant enough until it wasn't. Are you ready for tomorrow? I let slip a quick glance in the mirror. As our eyes met, the edges of Karen's lip twitched into a sly smirk. I am. Phew. Karen shrugged. You know, I'm not sure, since I've won so often. I wanted to try something new this time round. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not using a greenhouse this year. I just planted some flowers in the yard and hope for the best. I've noticed. Karen shrugged once more. I just don't know if it's good enough this year. The absolute gall of this woman, trying to play it cool, like she didn't know just how majestic her flowers were. I suppose it depends on the competition, I replied through pursed lips. Karen chuckled. You know, I came by your house the other day, but you weren't there. I couldn't help but take a look inside of your greenhouse. I guess I'm not the only one taking it slow this year. Karen pulled away while covering her ear, leaving me standing there awkwardly with my bloodied scissors. "What the hell? I'm so sorry," I stammered, snatching a pile of tissues from the box and handing it to her. I must have slipped. Karen dabbed her ear and flinched. She turned towards the mirror to inspect the damage. The cut was not deep. After apologizing profusely, she let me finish and left without saying a word, but I didn't care. My attention now entirely focused on the bloodied scissors. Immediately after Karen left, I closed shop and went home. The old woman's strange words rang through my head. It's not like I really believed them, did I? But then again, why not give it a go? I carefully mixed Karen's blood into the flower pot and went to bed. I've always been a light sleeper, so it was no surprise when I woke in the middle of the night. But I soon felt like something was off. Although the air felt unnaturally humid, my body was shivering. I wiped the sweat of my clammy skin, deciding to go downstairs for a glass of water. There it was, waiting for me on the kitchen table. No longer an empty pot, but the most beautiful flower I had ever seen. A graceful, flawless stem sprouting about 30 centimeters into the air. White silky petals like spun moonlight, their geometric patterns encompassing a ruby blossom. It burned the dark like a divine fire. Exhilarated and jubilant, I began jumping up and down victoriously. Not only was I going to win this year's competition, but I just sprouted a flower of such flawless beauty that I felt sure it would change the world. Giddy with glee, I stormed outside. I couldn't wait until tomorrow. The time for Karen's humiliation was now. As I ran down the road, I spotted something weird floating in the air. Yellow granules drifting in the dark. Spores of some kind. Pollen coming from Karen's house. As I approached, my nose crinkled. A foul smell filled my nostrils. Sour, like a field of wilting flowers. But not just any flower. No, this had the distinct smell of sunflower. But the pollen did burn, instantly irritating my skin. Thankfully, I'd pulled on a hoodie before storming outside. I pulled the hood deep over my face and hid my hands in my pockets. I got to Karen's house and rang the bell repeatedly, but nobody answered. After waiting in the dark a couple of moments, I crawled over her fence and jumped into the back garden. I knew she usually kept the kitchen door open. As I stepped into the kitchen, it felt like I'd set foot in a swamp. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe, clinging to my skin like a sweaty film. Slimy vines crawled along the floor. They'd stuck to the walls, flailing like black tentacles, inching forward towards the door. The kitchen was abuzz with mosquitoes, flies, and other vermin which swarmed me as I entered. While I stood swatting them, I failed to notice a vine contorting around my ankle until it began crushing my foot. I yelled in pain, but luckily Karen's kitchen knives were nearby. I grabbed one and hacked away at the vine's slimy flesh. The tentacle instantly retreated, followed by a deafening screech coming from upstairs. Its high pitch tolled through me like a struck bell. The vines back away, allowing me entry to the living room, which was saturated with more pollen. It burned my skin, producing painful boils and bumps. I grabbed a towel from the table and tied it around my face before following the vines upstairs. The air grew thick, devoid of oxygen, and I began feeling lightheaded. I kept fruitlessly swiping at the mosquitoes as I made my way forward. Karen's bedroom had become an area devoid of all sanity. Endless vines stitched the air, sprouting massive leaves interlocking into an inscrutable canopy. I felt a shiver run up my spine. My body felt heavy. Karen, it came out like a miserable squeak. I cleared my throat, imbuing my voice with as much strength as I could muster. Karen. All at once the vines began to vibrate, and the room trembled. Then the massive green leaves pulled away like a curtain, revealing what lay inside. In the center of the room emerged the source of all foliage, a humanoid mass of twisted and contorted skin, resembling the texture of withered bark. Cracked wounds oozed with sap, nurturing swarms of insects crawling and feasting on the decaying flesh. But among the unfathomable horror, I saw beauty. All over its head grew delicate flora, a tapestry of vibrant petals with vivid hues that defied logic and demanded my eye. These grotesque bouquets of unnatural beauty seemed almost luminescent, with a pair of sunflowers of the purest yellow growing in the sockets that once contained eyes, mocking the darkness that surrounded us. I couldn't help myself. Once again, a familiar fury took hold. For a moment I felt burning jealousy. Once again, I'd been eclipsed. Once again, Karen had given birth to beauty I could not obtain. With the knife still in my hand, I stormed forwards, but the creature's sunflower eyes sensed my presence. And once again the room vibrated, and its withered lips peeled back, revealing the depths of a gaping mouth from which erupted another deafening screech, rousing forth the insects from its flesh. Twisting and turning, my arms flailed through the air, but I had no choice. They chased me down the stairs, and outside, all the way back to my own house. Now I'm in my bedroom, writing this story while I can, sitting in front of the mirror with a huge smile on my face. Since most of the boils have burst, the itching is gone. If only you could see how beautiful I've become. But you will. Even now I can still see a cloud of pollen drift towards town, towards the thousands of sleeping tourists who will take my gift home with them. So, let me ask you, do you know the man who smells of sunflowers? This is my confession. I'm writing it down as a record. If anyone reads it, I'll be long gone. This is to let people know what really happened. I live in fear that a certain someone will find out I've told the story. It all started because of a dog. The nurse came out to the waiting room and called my name. I came over to her, and she handed me a leash and a collar. "I'm sorry, sir, there was nothing we could do," she said. I looked down at the empty collar that used to belong to my best friend, my dog, Jack. "Do you know what happened?" I said, fighting back tears. We couldn't be sure, but there was something in his bloodstream that caused him to deteriorate quickly. "You mean like poison?" "I wouldn't say that, but there seemed to be some toxins in his system, so it could have been poison." "Do you keep all of your household cleaners locked away?" "Of course," I said. "What are you saying, that I did this to my dog?" "No, it's just sometimes animals get into things they shouldn't." "I didn't poison my dog," I said louder than I should have, causing other pet owners in the room to look. "I never said you did, sir. I just said that I'm a negligent pet owner," I said, standing up and glaring at her. "Well, let me tell you something. That dog has been like a brother to me for over 12 years. I would never let anything happen to him." "I'm sorry, sir," she said, backing away. "I didn't mean to upset you." She dashed behind the counter, leaving me holding the leash and collar. I turned and walked out in a haze, got in my car, and headed for home with the leash and collar on the seat beside me where Jack always sat. I pressed the button and lowered the passenger side window a few inches out of habit so Jack could stick his nose out. Realizing what I'd done, my finger hovered over the button to roll up the window, but I couldn't do it. Tears streamed down my face as the cool spring air rushed in, but I left the window down in one last tribute to Jack. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve so I could see where I was going. My thoughts were jumbled up. Could I have caused Jack's death? I had everything closed up in the house. He never showed any interest in the things he shouldn't anyway. Ever since we moved to the suburbs, he seemed happier than ever. He loved having so much room to run around in rather than just the community park in the middle of the city. The only problem he had was learning where the boundary lines were. The first time he dug up neighbor Johnson's flower bed, I scolded him almost as much as the neighbor scolded me. The old man wasn't the friendliest. In fact, he was one mean sop. I had several neighbors who said to steer clear of old man Johnson. That's pretty tough to do when you're literally his next door neighbor. But I tried to keep Jack out of his flowers and away from his property. Unfortunately, Jack had other ideas. Every time I let him out, he would wait until my back was turned, then head for Mr. Johnson's flowers. I followed him and kept him away most of the time, but sometimes he was too slick. He started running around to the front of the house. While I was looking for him, he would circle around and come right back over to the neighbor's flowers. Mr. Johnson threatened to call the police. Then when that didn't work, he threatened to take matters into his own hands. I never thought he'd do it though. I was sure it was an empty threat. I mean, come on, they're just flowers. When I arrived home, he was out working on his flowers. I saw him sneak peeks at me as I took my empty collar into the house. I knew right then he had done it. My mind burned for revenge, but there was no way for me to prove it. I decided to let it go and focus on being a good neighbor. I had moved out to the country because I couldn't stand living in the city anymore. Well, I say I moved to the country, but it was more like the suburbs, or the outskirts of the suburbs. I had neighbors, just not many. There were 3 houses on my side of the road, and 4 on the opposite side. Each of us had a spacious backyard that was nearly an acre. It stretched back into the forest this neighborhood had been carved out of years ago. I came here around 4 months ago and tried my best to blend in with the neighbors. For the most part, I succeeded. I bought what everyone else recommended I should have: a riding mower with a mulcher and bag attachment that vacuums up the grass into bags so it doesn't lay around on the ground. I got the hedge trimmer even though I don't have any hedges should I decide to grow some. I got the chainsaw in case I ever decided to cut some firewood out of my stretch of forest. And lastly, I bought a rototiller just in case I ever needed a garden. I can honestly say I'd never seen a rototiller up close and personal until it was delivered to my garage. In fact, there were a lot of things in my garage that I had only seen for the first time, including a wheelbarrow. Living in an apartment for most of my life meant mowing, trimming, and gardening were foreign to me. My neighbor on the other side, Steve, is my sounding board and gossip for the neighborhood. I told him about Jack. "Man, I'll tell you what," he said. "If he did that to my dog, I'd cut him up in little pieces and bury him out in the trees." "You don't have a dog," I said. "That's not the point. The point is he had no business doing that." "Yeah," I said, taking a long drink of beer. "You've got to get him back," Steve said with a gleam in his eye. "What are you, in 5th grade? Come on, man, you can't tell me it doesn't bother you." "Hell yeah, it bothers me," I said, finishing my beer. "But I can't just up and vow revenge on my neighbor. This isn't the Old West, and my name isn't Hatfield or McCoy." "Alright, it's your decision, but if it were me, it's not you, so let's just drop it." "Consider it dropped," he said. "I won't bring it up again." I came home and settled on the couch to watch some TV, missing Jack jumping up beside me when the phone rang. "Hello," I said. "Are you kidding me?" "James," the neighbor from across the street said. "Am I kidding you about what?" "You let old man Johnson kill your dog, and you ain't gonna do nothing about it." "So much for Steve dropping it," I said with a sigh. "Man, you've gotta tell someone, report it or something." "Report what?" "That my dog was digging up the neighbor's flowers, then suddenly got sick and died." "Yeah," he said. "You gotta report that." "Okay, and what evidence do I have that he did anything?" "Come on." "No, really, Jack could have gotten into anything outside," I said. "Maybe he got tangled up with a snake and got bit." "I mean, that could be," James said. "What don't you think?" "I'm trying not to right now," I said. "But thanks for you and Steve trying to whip me into a frenzy over it." "Sorry, man, I just don't want old man Johnson to walk all over you," he said. "He's done that with so many others. That's why the house was so cheap. The last guy that lived there disappeared mysteriously. So what do you want me to do? Go all John Wick and blow the dude away?" I'm not saying that," James said. "I just don't think you should get away with it." "Okay, I'm done talking now. I'm gonna watch some TV and go to bed. Well, if you need anything, I won't be calling you or Steve." I hung up the phone and immediately regretted it. I knew they were just concerned, but I didn't want to think about it right now. I looked over at the empty spot on the couch where Jack would have been lying. I could see him lift his head, as if to ask, "What's wrong? Are we going outside? Do you want to play ball?" All within the space of a few seconds while he wagged his tail at warp speed. I turned off the TV and dragged myself to bed. I didn't want to think about today, or tomorrow, or anything else for that matter. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke to the sound of knocking. It wasn't forceful, but it was enough to wake me up. I looked over at my alarm clock, and it said 10:18 in the morning. I'd overslept. Luckily, it was Sunday, and although there were things I wanted to do, they weren't urgent. I got up and stumbled to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Mr. Johnson standing there looking unhappy, as usual. "Good morning," I said with a yawn. He said. "I just came over to see when you were going to pay for the flowers that mutt of yours ruined." I blinked. He couldn't have said what I thought I just heard him say. "Excuse me," I said. "You know, all the flowers that mangy mutt of yours dug up, you're going to pay me for them. You do realize he passed away yesterday," I said, trying to stay calm. He said. "And you had nothing to do with that," I said in my most sarcastic voice. "I absolutely did not," he said, yet something about how he said it made me not believe him. "I'll tell you what," I said, feeling my blood start to boil. "You buy me a new dog and I'll pay for your stupid flowers." "I didn't have anything to do with what happened to your dumb dog," he growled. And I didn't have anything to do with what happened to your flowers, I said, then pushed the door closed. He jammed his foot in the door and leaned inside. Be careful, he said quietly, or you might find yourself joining your precious puppy. He pulled his foot out, and the door slammed shut. I stood there in a daze. He had just threatened me. I had no doubt he had killed my dog. I went to the kitchen, still dazed, and got a beer out of the fridge. I brought it back to the living room and sat down on the couch, still thinking about what he'd said. I finished drinking, and before I knew it there were 5 empty cans sitting on my coffee table. I heard the neighbor's car rumble out of his garage and watched out my living room window as he drove away toward town. My list of things I wanted to do today just got pushed aside. I went to my garage and got out my rototiller. I started it up and guided it around the side of the house, headed for the backyard where I wanted to plant my garden. As I passed between my house and the neighbors, I saw the flowers he had replaced and suddenly thought of Jack. I swerved toward his house without thinking about it. When I got to the flower bed, I engaged the blades and shredded the entire thing. After I was done, I steered back over to my backyard, whistling a happy tune. I got to where I wanted my garden, right behind the house, and started ripping up grass. I ran back and forth over the patch I wanted to dig up. At least that was the plan. If someone would have had a camera recording me, they definitely would have been able to send it into one of those funny video shows. This was my first time running my rototiller. I started out setting the depth too low, and when I engaged the drive wheels, the tines dug in and took me for a ride. I didn't realize I had it set on fast speed. I raced along running behind the machine, desperately trying to grab the handle that turned the power wheels off. Eventually, I was able to stop it and take a breather. The next time was nearly as bad. I set it to low speed, but it didn't want to go anywhere, so I had to push with all my might to get it to move. I had no desire to switch it back to high. Just when I was about to give up, it suddenly caught and took off, dragging me along behind it as I desperately reached for the lever to stop it. After about an hour of this, I needed a break. I went inside to get a drink. When I came back out, my neighbor was leaning on my rototiller looking very unhappy. "What do you think you're doing?" he said. "Just trying to plant a garden." "You destroyed my flowers," he said through gritted teeth. I looked over toward his house. "Oh my," I said, holding my hand up to my mouth in mock shock. "How on earth did that happen?" "You know damn well how it happened," he growled. "I'm calling the police." "While you're at it, make sure to tell them how you poisoned my dog," I said, starting up my rototiller. "Oh yeah, that mutt that was too stupid not to eat the steak that was laying in the flowers." My eyes burned with hatred. It was one thing to suspect someone of something so heinous. It was something else entirely to have them admit it and shove it in your face. I turned away to keep myself from decking him and ending up in jail, but when I did, I bumped the controls, sending the rototiller forward with the blades digging up the ground. Unfortunately, he was standing right beside it, and his foot got caught in the blades. He screamed in pain as I struggled to stop the machine. He lay there in agony as blood poured from his nearly severed foot. "You bastard, I'll make sure you go to prison for the rest of your life for this." I looked down at him and realized he would do it. The man who had murdered my dog was going to make sure I went to jail, and he would probably get away with it. It was his word against mine. My mind was flooded with all the evil that runs rampant in this world. Rage filled me at the thought of such an injustice being allowed to go unpunished. Something in my head snapped. I saw Jack happily digging in his flower bed. Then I saw him eating the steak that had been laid out and getting sick. I looked down at this horrible man and knew what I had to do. I engaged the rototiller and drove right over him, the blades tearing into him as I went. He screamed until I got to his face, and the blades ripped through it, making him mute when they tore out his tongue. I turned and ran back over him again as he tried to crawl away, but I steered the machine toward him, ripping chunks of flesh and turning the soil a deep red hue. I turned and ran over him again, squishing organs out into the ground and grinding them up. Somehow, he was still moving, his hand raised up in a stop sign, which I tilled over. Back and forth I went over, and over that section of ground until there was nothing left but dark, moist dirt, and some larger bones the machine couldn't grind up. I went to the garage and got my shovel, dug a hole right in the middle of my garden, and buried his bones and shreds of clothes there. I covered them up with dirt and proceeded to plant over top of it. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at my nicely tilled garden that was planted and ready to grow. I turned my tiller back towards the house and nearly ran over Steve. "What the hell did you do?" he said. "What do you mean?" I said, feeling the sweat starting to form on my forehead. "You know exactly what I mean," he said. You've never run that tiller before, have you?" he said. "No, and you didn't think to call me." "Well, that's alright, buddy," he said, smiling as he clapped his hand on my back. "It was worth it watching you being dragged around." "Phew, you watched me," I said, feeling the cuffs close around my wrists. "Nearly peed myself laughing," he said. "I just wish I could have seen the whole thing." "Oh, so you didn't see all of it," I said, breathing a mental sigh of relief. "Nah, as much as I wanted to, I got dragged away." "Oh, you didn't miss anything," I said with a nervous chuckle. "Well, next time give me a holler before you run that thing," he said. "You're lucky you didn't kill anyone." I laughed, trying to hide the desperation in it as I glanced at the machine and saw spots of liquid on the side. I was never so glad in my life that the tiller was painted red. "We don't want that," I said, turning my tiller back towards the garage. "Maybe you can practice some more by tilling up my garden," Steve said, following alongside me. "I think I've had enough for one day," I said as we reached the garage. "Yeah, you should take a break," he said. "You look dead tired." I laughed a little too loud as he walked away toward his house. Once inside the garage, I closed the door and propped up the machine. I went into the house, got cleaning supplies including bleach, and cleaned the blades until they shone like new. The whole time I couldn't keep my hands from shaking thinking about what I'd done. Afterward, I went inside and took a long shower, then drank myself into a stupor and passed out on the couch. I woke up with a massive headache and stiff muscles from my fight with the tiller. I thought, what do I do about it? I thought for a long time before it hit me. I don't have to do anything about it. No one saw me do it. I thought back to Steve and how quickly he showed up. Did he really not see what happened? I tried to put it out of my head and go on with my life. I went to work on Monday and did my job the best I could. By Wednesday, I was doing good and was nearly back to normal. People had given me space assuming I was morose and standoffish because of my dog, so I let them think that. On Thursday, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, there was a police officer standing there. "Good evening, sir," he said. "I wonder if I could ask you some questions about your neighbor." "Which neighbor?" I said. "Mr. Johnson," he said, looking at his tablet. "What about him? It seems he may have gone missing." "Missing?" "Yes, sir. The last he was seen was Sunday." "Really? Do you recall the last time you saw him?" Images of bloody dirt, a hole full of bones, and his last desperate gesture of raising his hand to make me stop rushed through my head. "Sir," the officer said. "Oh, sorry, it may have been Sunday I saw him last." "Did he mention about going anywhere, like a trip or anything?" "Not that I recall," I said. "Oh, wait, I believed he mentioned taking a trip to Australia, something about going down under." The officer flipped back through his pages. "Are you sure?" he said. "I don't have anything on that." "Pretty sure," I said, trying to look certain. He looked at me and then scribbled a note on his pad. "Have you seen any strangers in the area? Maybe they looked like they were casing the place." "No, I haven't seen anyone like that." He scribbled on his pad. "What about you?" he said. "What about me? How did you get along with your neighbor? Were you close?" "I wouldn't call us close," I said. "We had our disagreements." He scribbled something on his pad. "Oh, is that important?" I said. "You never know," he said, staring at me. "What did you disagree about?" "Nothing really, just his flowers." "What about his flowers?" "Just that my dog would get into them and dig them up every once in a while, and that upset him." "Yes." The officer looked around me towards the inside of my house. "Where's your dog now?" He died." "When did that happen?" "Just last week." "Was the dog old?" "Not really, no." "Then what was the cause of death?" "Poison." He stopped scribbling on his pad and looked up at me. "Poison." I nodded. "Do you know if there was any foul play involved?" I made some kind of motion that was halfway between a head shake and a shrug. "So does that mean you don't know?" "No, I really don't know." "Wait, you said your neighbor was upset about his flowers getting dug up by your dog. Is there any way your neighbor had anything to do with the dog's death?" "Oh, no, I can't imagine him doing anything like that." "Him," the officer said. For the longest moment of my life, He just stared at me. I knew he had seen right through me. I had no doubt he was about to pull the cuffs off his belt and haul me away to prison. What was he waiting for? Was this some sick, sadistic tactic they taught cops when they wanted to sweat a confession out of someone? I couldn't take it. I opened my mouth to tell him everything. "Well, I won't take up any more of your time," he said. "If you think of anything important, don't hesitate to call." "Yes, of course, officer," I said. "I hope you find him." He nodded and turned back toward the driveway, getting in his car and moving on to the next house. Steve's house. Would Steve say he saw me doing something suspicious in the yard Sunday? I watched as the officer got out of his car and walked up to Steve's doorway. Halfway there, he paused and looked over at me. I dove into the house and slammed the door, breathing hard. He knows, I thought. I tried to calm down, but my heart was racing. I drank a beer, but that didn't help much. I wanted to drink another but was afraid if he came back over, I would spill my guts. I kept an eye on Steve's house. The officer seemed to be in there for a long time, much longer than he was at my house. Finally, he came out, laughing, Steve following along with a big grin on his face. He looked over at my house, and I ducked behind the curtain. He drove away, not bothering with the rest of the houses on the block. I knew then that Steve had ratted me out. I just didn't understand why the officer didn't come back and arrest me. The phone rang and I nearly jumped out of my skin. My shaking hand hovered over it for a moment, then picked it up. "Hello, you all right there, buddy?" Steve said. "You seem a little off today. I saw you peeking through the curtain. Just wanted to see where the officer went next." "Oh, you don't have to worry about him," Steve said. "He's cool." "Worried," I said. "Who said I was worried?" "My bad then, you just seemed like." "Hey, I've got another call. I'll talk to you later." "Okay, if you need." I hung up the phone and dropped it on the floor. I collapsed into bed, hoping it wouldn't be the last time I slept on a decent mattress, and fell into a fitful sleep. The officer never came back, and next day the sun rose just like it was supposed to. I started coming out of my funk and returning to normal. Within a few days, I recovered enough to weed my garden. I love to say I didn't move much more quickly through the parts of the garden that had blood and bones in it, but that would be a lie. I laid down black plastic once the seedlings popped up through the ground so I wouldn't have to go out and get rid of weeds. It was the longest summer I'd ever experienced. Every morning I would look out at my garden and then try my best to forget about it through the rest of the day. Sometimes I was successful, sometimes not. The end of summer harvest party was rapidly approaching. Every year a different house on the block hosted a party where everyone brought something, mostly from their gardens, and we had a feast. This year it was my turn. 2 days before the party, Steve came over and helped me harvest my corn. "You know, it's the strangest thing," Steve said. "I've never seen red tassels on corn before." "What do you mean?" I said. "The tassels on top of the corn stalks. They're red instead of yellow," he said. "But only in these 2 spots." Sweat poured from my forehead. That had nothing to do with the weather or doing work. "That's so odd," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. We finished picking the corn and took the bags to the back deck. "You want help shucking them?" he said. "No, I'm good. I'm gonna take a little break before I start." "All right, buddy. If you need any help getting ready for the party, just let me know." He slapped my back and I smiled as he walked over to his house. I dragged the bags into the garage and leaned them against the rototiller. I went in and got buckets, then shucked every last ear of corn, checking each one for even the slightest hint of red. Fortunately, I didn't find any. I was so tired I went to my bedroom and plopped in bed, falling instantly asleep. The party was in full swing. Everyone from the neighborhood was there, laughing and talking and having a great time. We said a blessing and started through the line to get some food. I waited until last like a good host and had just picked up a plate when I heard the first scream. I looked over, and a woman's dress was covered in blood. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, but I couldn't see how she'd gotten injured. Next came a scream from the other side of the room. Another woman's blouse was doused in blood. Next came a man shouting as blood covered him. I looked around the room and saw blood everywhere. I couldn't fathom what was happening. Was there some food poisoning happening? And then I saw it. A young man had just bit into one of my ears of corn when blood spurted out of it, covering him. I looked around the room and everyone else who was covered in blood was either holding or had just dropped an ear of corn. I ran over and grabbed the plate of corn just to have all the ears erupt, sending showers of blood all over me. Suddenly the screaming stopped. "It was you," a bloody woman said, pointing at me. "It was you," proclaimed the man with his finger aimed in my direction. "It was you, it was you, it was you," came the chant from all corners of the room. As they all closed in on me, I woke with a start, sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes darting around for the people closing in on me. But I was alone. I thought about it all that day. How could I back out of hosting the party? I called Steve that evening. "Hey, man, I'm really feeling under the weather," I said. "I'm not sure we should have the party here tomorrow. I don't want anyone getting sick." "Oh, wow, man, that's not good. Maybe we can have it at my place instead. I think that would be better." "Sure thing, man. Just bring your corn over so we can have it for tomorrow." "My corn? Of course, we need your corn. It wouldn't be a harvest party without corn." You know what, maybe if I just lay down for a while and see if I feel better." "Okay, but let me know before it's too late." I hung up the phone and collapsed to the floor, laying with my arms and legs out like I was about to make a snow angel. "I guess I'm stuck," I said to the ceiling. The ceiling didn't answer back. Day of the party came. I was busy trying to decorate as best I could while cleaning up the house and cooking the corn. Steve came over to help, and the guests arrived right around 6. I served drinks, and everyone talked and laughed as the music played in the background. Finally, it was time. Steve introduced me as the host and had a moment of silence for all those who couldn't be with us this year. Then it was time for the blessing. I don't remember what I said, but once I said amen, people were already lining up for the food. I stood back and watched, silently praying with each passing person that they wouldn't get a piece of corn. But of course, they all did. I saw the first person about to bite into their corn when I heard a scream. Surprisingly, it came from me. "I did it," I said. "I killed Old Man Johnson. I ran him over with my rototiller and kept running him over until he was dead. Then I buried his bones in the middle of my garden." Every eye was fixed on me. No one moved. They just stared. It was Steve who first approached me and put his hand on my shoulder. "We knew," he said with an odd smile. "What? You knew all along?" I said. He nodded. "I watched you run him over, and you didn't say anything. What did you want me to say?" "Hey, man, good job on killing that cranky old man that no one likes. But you don't know half the story of what that dude did to people in this neighborhood. Killing your dog was mild for him, but I murdered someone." Smiles grew on every face in the room. A few people even chuckled. "Welcome to the club," Steve said. "Everyone here has murdered someone. Why do you think it's such a quiet neighborhood?" My eyes grew wide as I looked around the room full of smiling people. "How do you think you bought your house for such a great price?" James said with a grin. I looked at Steve, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for someone to say it was a joke, but no one did. "Here, man," Steve said. "Have an ear of corn." Hello Reddit. My name is Aaliyah, or Leah for short. After an incident at work, I've been ordered to go through a mandatory minimum of 8 sessions of therapy. As part of my recovery, I've been advised to talk openly about a traumatic experience. However, as they didn't specify who to talk about it with, I figured I could use a public forum. I may be skirting the intentions a bit, but this was doomed to fail from the start. So let's talk about it. The summer when I didn't have a face. Just looking at that sentence seems ridiculous. It was one of those events that were so far disconnected from every other part of my life that, looking back at it, it doesn't seem real, like something that happened to someone else, and I've just been retelling the story to myself over and over. But it was as real as it gets, and to this day, I'm not sure what to make of it. Now, I want to be clear, they call this a delusion. I've gone through countless personality tests and trauma care, and they've given this many names, delusion being the most common, but I refuse to let myself be gaslit. This was real, and no one can tell me otherwise. I can admit my wrongdoings in every aspect of my life. But this, back in the summer of 2001, I was 11 years old. I'd been playing with my friend Belle over at her place all day, and we kind of forgot the time. I was supposed to come straight home after having dinner at her place, but we got stuck watching The Emperor's New Groove. So when the movie was over, I realized I was in big trouble. Mom was always a bit overprotective, as her only daughter and proclaimed miracle baby. I had a lot of expectations riding on me. It was already dark outside, but the fastest way to get home was the path next to Frog Lake. I wasn't allowed to go there because the streetlights were broken, but they'd be mad either way, so whatever. If I had to go through the park at night, for whatever reason, I was to go straight through, no matter what. That was my plan, at least. I was about halfway through the park, panting like a racehorse. One of my braids had come loose and kept poking my nose, making me stop to sneeze every 200 feet or so. I tried my best to keep running all the way through, but it got so dark I almost walked off the road. I had to slow down to catch my breath and navigate. You did not want to get lost near Frog Lake, where you'd drown. That, where the frogmen would drag you into the lake and force you to drink tadpoles. That's what the adults kept telling us, at least. I stopped at a branch in the road to consider the fastest way home, when I heard someone crying. Not a big cry, but a soft little one. A sniffling, like from a kid even smaller than I was. I knew I should have kept running, like Mom told me to, but it just made me too sad. I had to check if they were okay. I caught my breath and looked around, only to see someone on a park bench down the path to my left. They were underneath the only working street light, so I got a good look at them. She was a girl my age, with these little bantu knots and a bright blue summer dress. She was curled up on the bench, burying her face in her knees. And while my mom always taught me to be obedient, she also taught me to follow my heart. So I did. I sat down on the bench next to her. She kept sniffling and weeping, but it was so faint, like she'd done it all day. I scooched a bit closer. "Hi," I said. "I'm Leah." She didn't answer. She just turned her back on me. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Why are you crying?" Everyone is bad," she said. "They're bad, and I hate them." "Why? What they do?" "They put this stupid bracelet on, and I can't get it off." She sniffled. "They said it's an ugly girl's bracelet." She held her arm out, and it was this strange copper-like bracelet with little squares linked with iron rings. There were these white silhouettes of people etched into every other square, with splotches of an iron red color in between. I'd never seen anything like it, and the sides looked really sharp, like sharp enough to cut yourself with. It didn't look safe. "Let me see," I said, taking her hand and scooching even closer. There was no immediate way to take it off, but when the rings were a bit damaged, I inched it closer to my mouth, gnawed on it a bit, and managed to make a dent. With that, I pulled it apart. I did get a small cut on my lip though. The sides were really sharp. As the bracelet came off, the sniffles stopped. The girl turned to me. "Thanks, Leah," she said. "I've waited all day for someone to help me." And as she turned around, she smiled at me. Her eyes weren't red from crying. Her nose wasn't wet with snot. She looked perfectly normal, and she had my face. I just looked at her for a moment. She waved at me, now bracelet free, and skipped away into the night, giggling with excitement. The bracelet, still in my hand, crumbled into rust. The light above, the only working light on the street, flickered. Something about it just felt wrong, and I got back on my feet. I ran home as fast as I could. When I got home, my dad was waiting by the door. I shut the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and ran headfirst into him, crying my eyes out. I hadn't even noticed that I had this shiver. Maybe it was just adrenaline running off. I hugged his sweater and cried. After a few seconds, I noticed he wasn't moving. No pats on the back, no comforting words, no cute nicknames or kisses on the cheek. I stepped back and looked up at him. He was holding his hands out, like he was ready to defend himself. His eyes had gone wide, and his mouth hung open like a fish out of water. He'd never looked at me like that before. Never. "Dad." He fell backwards and knocked over a lamp. He crawled away from me, desperate to put distance between us. He called out. I couldn't stop crying. I was scared, and I didn't understand. He looked at me like I was a wild animal, when all I wanted was my dad. He hurried into the backyard, calling out to my mother over and over. He had this high-pitched note that I hadn't heard before, like he'd been hurt. I just sat down on the floor, buried my face between my knees, and cried. My tears felt strange on the skin of my knees. I sat there for a couple of minutes, until I heard a door open. I didn't look up. I was scared to see my dad like that again. "Leah, sweetie." It was my mom. "Honey, are you there?" I got back on my feet. It was my mom, on the other side of the room. She blindfolded herself with a towel from the bathroom. "I'm here, Mom." "Leah? Honey, can you come here?" I walked up to her, but when I was about 6 feet away, she held up a hand, urging me to stop. Slowly, "Honey," she said, "come here." She held out her hands. Looking back at it, I think she wanted to be sure I didn't try to take off her blindfold. We held hands, and she tried her best to smile. "Did you go by the lake?" she asked. "I need you to be honest with me. I didn't want to be late. You'd be mad. So you went by the lake, right?" I took a deep breath and slumped my shoulders. My mom held my hands in a tight grip. "Yeah," I admitted. "I'm sorry." My mom swallowed. I could hear her struggling to keep her breath steady. She was right there, on the edge of panic. "We're gonna fix this, honey," she said. We're gonna fix this." She made her way back to the kitchen and pulled out a paper bag. She told me we were playing a game and that I would get a prize if I kept the bag on. I was allowed to make holes for the eyes if I kept sunglasses on underneath, but I couldn't take it off. If I did, I had to warn them first. All the while, I could see my dad in the backyard, retching his guts up. "You gotta keep the bag on, honey," Mom said. "You gotta promise." I promised. That night, my dad could barely look at me. All he could give me was quick glances, and I could tell it was painful to him. He wanted to hug me, to care for me, but he was too scared. I'd never seen my dad scared of anything, and having him scared of me was heartbreaking. I could see the conflict in him. At least now he was back to calling me his little Leah. It was a start. My mom made me a sandwich and chocolate milk, but I had to eat it in my room. As soon as I was done, I had to put the bag back on. That first night, I sat by the edge of my bed and ate my sandwich in silence. The crust was cut off, like always. My mom was waiting just outside the door, but she couldn't come in as long as my paper bag was off. I didn't understand. How could I? "Mom," I said, "what's happening?" "Something bad happened, honey," she said, "but we're gonna fix it. You're gonna be okay." "I feel okay, Mom. I know you do." "Honey, you're doing great. You just have to be patient." "Can Belle come over tomorrow?" "I'm sorry, no. She can't come over until you're better. But we were gonna listen to CDs." "I'm sorry." "Honey," when I finished and put my bag back on, my mom came to my room and left a glass of water, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. I couldn't brush my teeth in the bathroom for some reason. Bag off, brushing, bag on again. Mom said goodnight through the door. I could hear her sobbing as she went back downstairs. I couldn't sleep that night. I twisted and turned for hours on end, but my pulse just wouldn't go down. Finally, I decided to use the bathroom, stretch my legs for a bit. Only then did I realize they'd blocked my door. Standing there, turning the knob over and over, I realized I was stuck. I could hear my parents arguing downstairs. Through the door, snippets of a longer, angrier conversation. "I'm gonna call them," Dad said. "First thing in the morning, we're calling them. You think they'll help us? You think they'll just do that? Out of the goodness of their hearts. What are we gonna do then? Have you forgotten what it cost us last time? What are we gonna do then? Have you forgotten what we paid?" "I haven't forgotten a goddamn thing. But what are we gonna do then? We're dealing with this. You and me. We're dealing with this." There was a quiet that hung in the air. Something that Mom had said sounded bad. Like dealing with this was a bad thing. "We're gonna need a gun." I woke up early the next morning, still leaning against the door. When my mom finally let me out, she had a few rules for me to follow until everything got sorted out. I was to stay inside. Above everything, I couldn't go outside. This was for my own protection, apparently. Secondly, I was to not look at my own reflection, not through puddles, a reflection in the windows, the bathroom mirror, anything. No looking at myself. Third, I could not touch my own face without gloves. The gloves I was given turned out to be oven mitts. And finally, if I ever took off the paper bag, I had to tell them about it in advance. That first day was the worst. I kept getting this awful claustrophobic feeling, like I was stuck in that damn bag. I had trouble breathing, and I felt trapped. Once, I took it off without warning my mom, but she managed to shield her eyes before it was too late. When I put the bag back on, I could tell she was furious. For a moment, I thought she was going to hit me. She'd never looked at me like that before. "Please, you can't just take it off," she said. "Never do that. Never again." Dad just wasn't around. He was out all day and only came back to fetch something from the garage. He and Mom talked for a bit on the driveway, then he was off again. He looked like he'd been crying. All the while, I was walking around with my face concealed and oven mitts covering my hands. Mom had taken down all mirrors, and Dad had covered the windows with brown packing tape. While I wasn't allowed to go anywhere, my mom still tried her best to keep me calm. She made me popcorn and allowed me to talk to Belle on the phone as long as I didn't say anything about being sick. We didn't talk for long. I ended up listening to my new Destiny's Child CD on my own. That memory of sitting on the floor of my childhood room wearing that bag and a pair of oven mitts is burned into my mind. While Mom was busy, I remembered my jewelry box. It had mostly plastic rings and clip-on earrings, but it had a built-in mirror on the inside of the lid. If I wanted to, I could see what the fuss was about. I dug it out and called out to Mom that I was taking off the bag in my room for a while. That way I'd at least get a warning knock before she entered. So I sat there, box in hand. I took off my oven mitts and opened it. As soon as the lock clicked, I got this chill up my spine, like dipping your toes in cold water, knowing you're about to wade out into the deep. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but it wasn't just wrong because Mom said so, but because I was doing something I shouldn't be able to do. I was breaking more than just rules. Still, I opened the box. Slowly, as soon as I saw the edge of my reflection, I heard something. A laugh in the distance, like a looming thunderstorm. A bright, joyous shriek. I slammed the box shut, and the laugh was reduced to a giggle, then nothing. My hands were so warm that I could feel my fingers sweating. I could have sworn the box was hurting me. Still, I had to try again. I had to know. I clicked the lid open again and heard a plastic crackle. It wasn't coming from the box, but something in the room. Looking around, I didn't see anything obvious. I could hear my heart beating through my chest. Then I looked up. My toys had moved. Every doll, every stuffed animal, their heads were turned towards me. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I opened the lid just a little and heard another crack, and again the distant laugh, but now it was more like a hysterical cackle, almost mechanical, repeating in the same pattern, louder and louder. I saw my own throat. My skin looked ashen and dry. I could see my discolored veins. Every set of eyes on every poster turned towards me. And it was only now that I noticed that everything looked different. Every toy, every picture, anything with a pair of eyes, the entire room was staring at me intently. Their eyes had changed color. They looked like mine. I kept opening the box. Slowly, something in me wanted to close it, to throw it away. There was a banging noise, like distant thunder, and that ever-growing laugh. I saw my chin, withered skin, breaking into something pale. I held my hand up, about to touch my own face, to feel it out. I know I shouldn't. I know there were rules. But in the edge of the reflection, I saw my hand come closer, and as I touched my chin with the edge of my index finger, I swear, I felt bone. Then my reflection moved. My mom burst through the door. She'd been trying to get my attention by banging on the door, but it was as if I'd been hypnotized. She came in with her eyes closed, wielding a hammer from Dad's toolbox. "Put it down," she screamed. "Put it down now." I put down the jewelry box. Seconds later, she fell to her knees and smashed it to pieces. She kept hitting it over and over until her arm grew weak. When she couldn't hit it anymore, she just dropped the hammer to the floor. She ripped a pillowcase from my bed and wrapped it around my head. When I could no longer see her, she took her blindfold off and wrapped her arms around me. She cried in a way I'd never seen before, like a wailing child. These big, hulking sobs. She hugged me so tight that I had trouble breathing through the pillowcase. Leah, please," she cried. "You have to listen to me. You have to listen. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry too. Honey, I'm so sorry." That night made me realize that there was more to this than I understood. My mom and dad were doing this for a good reason. I decided to just hunker down and do what I was told. To see this as being sick, watching movies, eating snacks, and just waiting for it to be over. I didn't mind anymore. We were in this together. Over the next few days, things started to turn into a new kind of normal. I spent most of my time with Mom just hanging out, watching TV, playing games on our shared computer. I was obsessed with The Sims, and I got to play as much as I wanted. Mom would sit next to me, asking me about the characters and the stories I was making up. She even let me take off the oven mitts as long as I kept the bag on. We'd also made a cover using the pillowcase she'd ripped up, so I had a more comfortable option. But I was often reminded that something was wrong. Dad wouldn't come home until late in the night, and I had to keep lying to Belle about why we couldn't hang out. Mom just gave me this apologetic look, but didn't say anything. We trusted one another now. It was a white lie. Everything would be okay. I lived like that for 3 weeks. I stopped questioning it. I stopped trying. I went through the motions and hoped it'd be over. Sometimes I'd sit by a gap in my taped up window, just watching the people outside pass me by, much like the Sims in my game. At times, I imagined them turning towards me, looking at me with my own eyes. Sometimes, they really did. One night, when Dad came back, something was wrong. They usually talked a little, and then he went straight to bed. This time, they sat up long into the night. My mom had stopped locking me in my room, so I sneaked out to listen. They were being more quiet than usual, and I couldn't help myself. "We gotta bring her," Dad said. "She has to be there." "They can't," Mom cried. "We can't, she'll never be the same. You said we should handle it. This is how we handle it. But she doesn't have to be there. She has to be there, and she has to do it." The next day, Dad didn't go anywhere. He sat with me while Mom prepared breakfast. He gave Mom a long look, sighed, and turned to me. I met his eyes from behind my sunglasses. "Leah, honey, we're going on a trip tonight. Outside." Yeah, he smiled. "We're going out on a trip. But I need you to be very careful and to listen really closely. Can you do that?" "Sure, yeah," I nodded. "Where are we going?" "We're gonna make you okay." "Honey, you are." Dad nodded. He kept his smile firm, but it wasn't genuine. I could tell. That night, Mom and Dad came into my room. I wrapped my head in a new pillowcase that didn't have any holes for my eyes. I couldn't see, and they also gave me a pair of earmuffs. I couldn't hear, couldn't see, and had trouble breathing through the fabric. Mom gave me a big hug. "You can do this," she said. "Stay strong, be patient, and do what you need to do." They took me to the car, put me in the back seat, and drove off. I heard them talking in the background, but the earmuffs blocked most of it. I picked up a yeah or a no every now and then. I just sat there with my arms crossed, trying my best to stay calm. Whatever was going on felt bad. Again, like we were doing something we shouldn't. I could feel the road shift. It went from smooth asphalt to gravel, and then a bumpy dirt road. I had to steady myself against the door to keep my earmuffs on. I could hear a low sorry, "Honey," from my mom. I reminded myself to do what she said. Be patient. Be strong. After what felt like an eternity, the car stopped. Still seeing nothing, the car door opened, and a hand led me outside. I'd recognize Mom's hand anywhere. It was all I needed to feel safe. She led me through a forest path, down a short hill, and into a clearing. Mom and Dad asked each other really quiet questions, mostly just 1 or 2 words. The only one I caught was "here." Finally, I heard my dad shout something. Mom pushed the earmuffs closer together, blocking everything but my own heartbeat. I could feel water seeping into my sneakers. There was an argument, something loud and angry. Dad rushed past me. I felt the texture of his jacket brush against my arm. Another scream, a back and forth. Mom took off the earmuffs. She put something warm in my hands, something heavy, something metallic. "You have to take it off," Dad said. "She has to see her. It has to transfer." Mom didn't respond. She just kept sobbing as she unwrapped the pillowcase. Everything was blurry while my eyes adjusted. Shades of black and withered green. Blue petals from a flower crushed under my sneaker. We were deep in the woods. I could feel a faint breeze, making the hairs on my arm stand up. I felt nothing on my face, however, nothing at all. And right there, collapsed in the soggy moss, was the little girl I'd met by Frog Lake. She was tied up and placed on the ground in front of me. I was holding a handgun. I didn't know it at the time, but the safety was off. "Honey, listen," said Mom. "You have to do this. It has to be you. Don't think, just point at it and squeeze the trigger, okay?" "Leah." "Honey, follow my lead." Dad was standing on the side, closing his eyes. His hands were bloody. The girl dropped in front of me looked like me, but there was something off about her. I couldn't quite put my finger on a single thing. It wasn't just the hair, there were slight differences overall. Her eyes were a little further apart, her chin a bit longer. She looked like me, but it wasn't really me. "It's not fair." The girl screamed. "You made a deal. Don't listen to it, honey. Don't listen. Just aim down the sight." And She came to me willingly. She set me loose. You owe me. It's evil. It's not human. You can't listen, Leah. I looked at the girl who had my eyes, my face. They threw me away just to get you, she spat. What makes you so special? Why'd you get to be? What's she saying, Mom? I asked. What does she mean? Leah, just do what I tell you to. Be strong. There are no miracles. The girl screamed. Some prices are just higher than others. There are no miracles. You are no miracle. I could see her losing herself. The bone structure of her skull pushing against my ill-fitting face. Eyes losing their color. Hair withering as her scalp was laid barren. Bantu knots dropping like little pine cones. She shrieked at me with a manic smile on my face. She was becoming less of a girl and more of a thing. One or none, they said. One or none. One or none. She twitched closer. Before my dad put his boot on her back, pushing her into the wet moss. Guess which one of us got the one and which one got dumped in a lake with nothing but a bracelet. I looked up at my mom. She met my gaze. She couldn't help but to look at me, and she saw something she shouldn't have. I don't know what she looked at in that moment, but her eyes dilated, and a scream got stuck in her throat. Her eyes crossed as she fell backwards, struggling to breathe. My dad came up behind me, pointed my head forward, and aimed my arms for me. All I had to do was pull the trigger, and I'd save everyone. Them. Dad. I'd get my face back. Remember this, the girl thing purred. Remember this every time you look yourself in that goddamn mirror. Little miracle. I squeezed the trigger and the gun went off. For a moment, the world stood still. In the muzzle flash, I had this brief image of sitting on that park bench next to Frog Lake, holding hands, with a sister I never had. A sister that was never truly born, dropped unceremoniously into the depths of the lake. A promise fulfilled to a power below. But in that eternal moment, in the white flash of the gun, we were just sitting on the bench together, holding hands. What happened afterwards is a bit of a blur. My mom was taken to the hospital. I didn't have to wear the pillowcase anymore. My dad threw the gun in a lake. And then, we never talked about any of that ever again. Not that we got much chance to. Weeks later, my mom got diagnosed with cervical cancer. She lasted 4 years. My dad died of a brain aneurysm on my 17th birthday. I moved out of Tomskog, Minnesota to live with my aunt. In West Virginia, I'd spend my time at the computer. It started with mods for games, and slowly turned into front-end programming. Had a nice job, nice benefits, and a move to Orlando to work at a proper office. I've been working there ever since, going on, 11 years. It feels strange putting this all to paper. I've had no one to talk to about it. And medical professionals don't really agree with the whole notion of giving their mental patient the benefit of the doubt. There was an incident at work. We closed a deal with a large client, and my boss was doing this pep talk where we all went around the room with a mirror to psych ourselves up. We were to say an amazing thing about ourselves. When I looked at myself, I was going to say I had a great sense of humor, but my words got stuck in my mouth. Looking back at me was me, but not really. It was me, but I had Bantu knots in my hair, and then I saw myself blink. I don't really know what happened after that. I broke the mirror and tried to stab someone with a cake knife. Apparently, I was carried out by security and put on immediate medical leave. They'd never had a problem with me before, and I'm team lead in a group of 9 people, so they're not eager to get rid of me. Now I can't stress this enough. I'm fine. This hasn't happened before. I think, if anything, this had to do with my boss calling me a miracle worker, and it triggered something in me. Maybe something out there lives on, through me, and maybe that something wants, desperately, to come back.